What we're going to begin with, and for the vast bulk of the program, we're going to begin by taking a look at the historical development of the fascist milieu that we have been looking at for the past 2 weeks. We have been looking at a milieu consisting of elements of the petroleum industry, in particular the petroleum engineering industry and independent oil operators, the intelligence community, the defense industry, the political superstructure of America, and last but most assuredly not least, the Third Reich residua imported into the United States under the auspices of the intelligence organization of Reinhard Gehlen. Gehlen, whose last name once again is spelled G-E-H-L-E-N, was Hitler's chief of intelligence for the Eastern Front during World War II, and he and his entire organization, Fremde Heere Ost, or Foreign Armies East, generally abbreviated as FHO, were brought into the United States at the end of World War II. They became in turn the CIA's Department of Russian and Eastern European Affairs. They then became the de facto NATO intelligence organization. And finally, when the Federal Republic of Germany, the former West Germany, was incorporated in 1956, Gehlen and his organization were installed as the BND, the Bundesnachrichtendienst, the official intelligence service of first West Germany, now Germany. That organization has wielded an enormous impact on world history by virtue of its pivotal role in the Cold War, and the Gehlen organization and its effects are going to be one of the major foci of this long archive show that I'm doing. This is not to say that the Gehlen organization exists in a vacuum, far from it. On the contrary, the important thing about understanding the Gehlen organization is how it functioned, what permitted it to come into existence in the capacity that it came into existence, namely the multinational corporate milieu, which was very sympathetic to fascism, the large domestic fascist organizations in the United States, which, as we shall see, began to network with some of the elements brought in under the auspices of Gehlen and the very closely related anti-Bolshevik bloc of nations. The Gehlen organization is a vitally important organization, and we're going to be taking a look in the weeks to come at the Gehlen organization as literally a Trojan horse brought into the United States. But I don't want any listener to make the mistake of thinking that the Gehlen organization exists in a vacuum. It is pivotally important, arguably the single most important political element in the second half of the 20th century, but it most assuredly does not exist in a vacuum, and it is vital to understand the political and economic environment and also military environment that it existed in order to understand how it came to have the influence that it had. What we're going to do this evening is go back all the way to the Second World War, and we are going to begin to take a look at, we are going to take a look at the historical development of the milieu that we looked at in the last 2 weeks, namely the intersection of the American far right, as I said, the petroleum industry, the intelligence community, the Gehlen organization, the defense industry, and some of the major American political movers and shakers over the last quarter of a century or so. The first thing that we're going to do this evening is listen to a radio show that was broadcast, an American radio program called High Command, that was broadcast during the closing year or two of the Second World War. This particular program might sound a trifle humorous to some people because it is, from a stylistic or formal standpoint, somewhat dated. It might sound a trifle hammy or corny, but the information communicated is not only very important, but beyond that I will be corroborating many of the central informational points from documentary sources as we proceed through the broadcast this evening. After listening to this program, which is approximately 45 minutes in length, we are then going to begin examining some information from a very important book, a book which very tragically was eclipsed along with the work of its author during the McCarthy period. That book, from 1944, is called The Nazis Go Underground, by a very important anti-fascist writer named Kurt Riess, last name R-I-E-S-S. The first thing we're going to begin looking at is how the German General Staff in World War II was looking upon their broad plans for conquering certainly Europe and possibly the world. They were not just looking at the effects of one war, but rather they were thinking in terms of a decades-long strategy. That is important to understand because we're going to be looking in weeks to come at the Gehlen organization, which was a direct offshoot of the German General Staff and the Third Reich National Security Establishment. We're going to be taking a look at how it wielded the influence it did in the United States. But first, we're going to begin taking a look at how the German General Staff planned to gain certainly European, if not world domination. And it should be understood, and this is very important, that they did not intend to do it in one war. Rather, they were looking at a long-term strategy, something to be accomplished over a long period of time, and something that I would argue that they have accomplished as we prepare to move into the 21st century. Following that, we're going to take a look at the German General Staff's realization by October and by the last quarter, I should say, of 1941, that in fact the Second World War was lost from the Axis standpoint. The German General Staff actually had a meeting on December 9th, 1941, 2 days after Pearl Harbor, at which they began to make plans for rebuilding the German army after what they saw as an inevitable defeat. Recall that, of course, on December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor was attacked by the Japanese. At that point, the United States was certain to enter the Second World War. The German General Staff understood the importance of that, as well as their inability to knock out the Soviet Union during the warm months, and the fact that the German General Staff had not planned to withstand the bitter Russian winter meant that they were going to get bogged down in a war of attrition on the Eastern Front. That is not something they had planned to do. The German General Staff, literally, on December 9th, 1941, saw the handwriting on the wall, and they began to make plans to resurface after what they understood at that point was an inevitable German defeat. They then began to make plans to rebuild the German army after the war, and that'll be the next thing that we look at. After that, we're going to take a look at the German Nazi Party, the NSDAP's plans to go underground and then resurface. Although the German generals formally accepted that they were going to be defeated in December of 1941, the Nazi Party itself took a little longer. On May 16th, 1943, the Nazi Party, in particular under the auspices of the SS and Gestapo, began making formal plans to not only go underground, but to resurface in years to come. It should be remembered that the last 2 years or so of World War II for the Third Reich represented what is known in military terms as a rearguard action. They were basically covering their retreat, and we're going to begin taking a look at how the Nazi Party planned to go underground, and in particular, how the going underground, the eclipsing, the willful self-induced eclipse of the Nazi Party, not the demise, but the eclipse of the Nazi Party, was done under the auspices of Heinrich Himmler's SS and Gestapo. Himmler himself, as we shall see, was a student of underground political movements, and with 2 years to prepare for going underground, Himmler, with his expertise, was in a position to lay the groundwork for a resurgence of Nazism in years after the formal military defeat of the Third Reich. Following that, we're going to take a look at how, and this is a very important methodological consideration, and this particular methodological consideration is absolutely central to the long-term historical picture that we're going to be looking at, that we have been looking at in weeks past, and that we're going to be looking at for a number of weeks to come. One of the lessons that the German military, as well as the Nazi Party leadership, learned from the German defeat at the end of World War I was that they could use communism, or the threat of communism/Bolshevism, to their own political advantage. And again, it's very important to understand that neither the Third Reich nor the Reinhard Gehlen organization, that was an offshoot of it, existed in a vacuum. Far from it. In fact, if we are to properly understand these things, it is to be understood that they did not exist in a vacuum, but rather they existed in a broad political and economic milieu, which they were able to utilize to their own advantage. One of the things that I have talked about for many, many years here, and that I go into every Memorial Day, is the massive support provided by Western, in particular American, financial and industrial institutions to the fascist powers of Europe. Those industrialists who greatly feared the economic and political consequences of socialism/communism, Bolshevism, were only too happy to collaborate with fascists, and it is that political reality that is central to an understanding of how the German General Staff and the Nazi Party were able to use the threat of communism or Bolshevism in a strategic manner. one of the things that we looked at in Radio Free America program number 10 was how the German army at the end of World War I was utilized or the supposedly demobilized German army at the end of World War I was utilized to combat the abortive socialist or Marxist revolution in Germany that took place on November 9th, 1918. The president of the Weimar Republic, the newly created Weimar Republic, Friedrich Ebert, set up 3 military organizations, the Freikorps or Free Corps, the Einwohnerwehren, and the Zeitfreiwilligenverbände, in which the supposedly demobilized German army was reconstituted to fight communism. This permitted the German General Staff to not only retain power in Germany, because not only the industrialists and former imperial government officials, but also the Social Democrats themselves. The socialists were greatly afraid of the Bolsheviks and the workers' and soldiers' Soviets that were set up in the course of the abortive German Revolution, so they were only too happy to enlist the support of the German General Staff and the supposedly demobilized German army. This permitted the German army to circumvent the regulations imposed, at least formally, by the Versailles Treaty. And as we have seen, the Freikorps or Free Corps, the Einwohnerwehren, and the Zeitfreiwilligenverbände remained in place underground as the so-called Black Reichswehr. They not only continued to grow and to represent an underground formation and growth of the German army, but perhaps even more importantly, they systematically assassinated not only the Marxist, but the legitimate democratic leadership of Weimar Germany, thereby paving the way for Hitler's rise to power. The next thing we are going to look at is how the threat of communism was used by the German General Staff to retain the integrity of the German military and to promote its growth in spite of the Treaty of Versailles. And even more importantly, we are going to take a look at how the Allies at the end of World War I aided and abetted this situation, because they too were deeply afraid of the threat of Bolshevism. Recall that, of course, in 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution occurred, and this represented the first Marxist state in the world. Beyond that, it was an enormous empire which now had a Marxist government. This was deeply terrifying to not only American industrialists and financiers, but the General Staff, and indeed even to socialists themselves. And as a result of the fear on the part of the Western Allies that Germany, too, a major industrial power, might go, quote, communist, unquote, they aided and abetted the reinstitution not only of the former imperial government, but also of the German General Staff and the military in general. No pun intended. They saw to it that the military remained in place, and they turned a blind eye to the rearming and reformation of the German military despite the Treaty of Versailles. And this strategic consideration, the awareness on the part of the German General Staff, and later, as we will see, the Nazi Party, of how the fear of communism could be used to their own strategic and military advantage, that is central to the long-term understanding of the development of the forces that we are looking at in this massive archive show, as we are looking at the formation, the historical and political evolution of the milieu that we've been looking at the last 2 weeks, in which the American far-right Third Reich residua, the petroleum industry, the U.S. intelligence community, the defense industry, and the mainstream American political structure are synthesized. The awareness on the part of the Germans of this tactical consideration is absolutely central to the formation and development of this milieu, and that milieu is in control not only of the United States, but the world at this time. Following that, we're going to take a look at, once again, sticking with Kurt Riess's The Nazis Go Underground, we're going to take a look at how the Germans viewed, at the end, this as World War II drew to a close, at how they viewed the coming occupation of Germany. As one might well expect, they feared most of all a partial or complete occupation of Germany by the Red Army, because that would have been inimical to the reformation not only of the industrial structure of Nazi Germany, which, recall, as we've looked at in Uncle Sam and the Swastika, was deeply involved, as well as the first 2 Radio Free America shows, was deeply involved with and cooperated with actively the multinational corporate community, American industrialists and financiers in particular. By the way, we're covering a very we're covering a large piece of history this evening. There is no way, even during the course of this long archive show that I'm going to be doing in installments, that I can fill listeners, particularly new listeners, in on all of the aspects of what I'm looking at. So I strongly recommend that listeners who are new or who do not have the information, such as Uncle Sam and the Swastika, U.S. industrial cooperation with the Third Reich, the first two Radio Free America shows, Uncle Sam and Il Duce, please get a hold of those, because those are absolutely central to an understanding of the historical forces that we're examining during the course of Radio Free America 37. But again, the Third Reich, as its at least formal demise was approaching, understood that having the Western allies, the United States and Germany and France, occupy Germany was vital to their survival and to the perpetuation of the political realities of the Third Reich, and that the partial or complete occupation of Germany by the Soviet Union would be inimical, would be absolutely devastating to their long-term prospects for revival. Following that, we're going to take a look at a book called The Last Hero, Wild Bill Donovan by Anthony K. Brown. We're going to take a look at a very interesting, important, and enigmatic chapter in World War II history. Namely, we're going to take a look at not only the negotiations which were being undertaken by the German General Staff under Vatican auspices with the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, that was America's World War II intelligence service, the precursor of the CIA. We're going to take a look at those negotiations, those attempts by the German General Staff to open up the Western Front to Eisenhower's armies, thereby permitting the Allies, the Western Allies, I should say, to occupy most of Germany. By the way, bear in mind, too, that as any competent history of the Third Reich will demonstrate, I'm not going to go into that in any detail this evening, one of the things that Hitler sought to do during the closing months in the last year or two of the Second World War was to convince the United States and Britain to abandon their alliance with the Soviet Union and to hook up with Germany and to engage in an anti-communist crusade. Any competent history of the Third Reich, William L. Shirer's The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, any good history of Nazi Germany will discuss that, any good history of the Second World War. I'm not going to go into that at any great length, but bear in mind that that was a major strategic goal of the Third Reich during the closing years of the war. Again, we're going to be taking a look at, from the Last Hero, I should say, how the German General Staff was formally making approaches to the United States and Britain under the auspices of the Vatican, and by contacting the officers of strategic services, they were seeking to open up the Western Front to Eisenhower's armies. Now, the official history has it that no such deal was ever cut. However, as Anthony K. Brown points out, the curious episode of the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen. The Ludendorff Bridge was one of the largest bridges over the Rhine River, one of the major defense points of the Third Reich during the closing months of the war. That bridge, curiously, was never blown, and this permitted Eisenhower's armies to not only capture the bridge intact, but to pour into Germany. And that particular capture, the capture of the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, the bridge over the Rhine, did in fact permit the Western Allies to occupy most of Germany, despite the fact that the Red Army had handled the bulk of the fighting in Europe, even after D-Day, but certainly virtually all of it up to the invasion of Normandy in June of 1944. And as Anthony K. Brown points out, it may have been, this is by no means definite, but it may have been that the Ludendorff Bridge was deliberately kept intact. As he says, anyone familiar with clandestine operations can view this curious historical episode and its official explanation with a cold eye. This is not something which is definite, but certainly Stalin was operating under the assumption that there had in fact been a deal between Nazi Germany and the Western Allies to permit the Western Allies to occupy most of Germany. There certainly were negotiations underway. Officially, they did not come to any serious fruition, but as Anthony K. Brown points out, the episode of the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen suggests that official history to the contrary notwithstanding, such a deal may have been cut. And again, this is not something that I am saying with any degree of, I'm not saying this definitely, but as Anthony K. Brown documents, it is certainly a possibility that has to be very seriously considered. Food for thought and grounds for further research. although I personally doubt that we will ever know the full truth. Following that, we're going to take a look at an interesting piece of information in the author's notes, Anthony K. Brown's preface to The Last Hero. And for those people who think that perhaps all of the stuff about World War II is a little too arcane, it happened too long ago, so what, who cares, it has no current relevance, we're going to take a look at what happened to the first 4 people who attempted to write the history of the Office of Strategic Services in the post-World War II period. The first 4 major historians who attempted to set the historical record straight and to shed the light of history on the secret operations of the OSS died before they were able to do it. Finally, Anthony K. Brown was approached by none other than William Casey, who became CIA director under Ronald Reagan. Casey was in charge of secret intelligence in Europe for the OSS during World War II, and William Casey tabbed Anthony K. Brown to do the official history because, as he said, and this was in 1977, Britain would be Anthony K. Brown is from Britain, said a British citizen would be a perfect person to do the history because he would be neither Democrat nor Republican. This simply by way of underscoring even more than 30 years after the formal end of World War II, the importance and the political sensitivity of the information from the period that I'm going into at this time. One of the major methodological considerations for the reconstitution of the Third Reich as it saw its defeat approaching was to form alliances with the very powerful fascist movements in other countries. Again, in numerous archive shows, I have discussed the profound role of American industrialists and financiers, as well as other Western industrialists and financiers, in helping to not only arm Nazi Germany, but to support Hitler politically. It should be remembered that, as we looked at in Radio Free America 10, among other programs, as well as the first 2 Radio Free America archive shows, these same industrialists and financiers helped to back very, very strong fascist movements in the United States, as well as other Western countries. Other industrialists and financiers in France and Britain did the same thing. Many of these organizations were viewed as, quote, nationalist, unquote, but in fact they were fascist. One of the things that Kurt Riess talks about is how the plans, and again, this book was written in 1944, the plans for the reconstitution of the Third Reich would have undoubtedly involved the hooking up of underground Third Reich elements with many of the fascist elements which were still active to a considerable extent in some of the Western nations, the Western Allied nations. We're going to take a look in particular at a recommendation, or what Kurt Riess does here is he speculates that if he were preparing a coming Nazi underground, he would certainly follow what appears to be the methodology of the Third Reich, and that is form alliances with some of the fascist elements in the United States and Britain. And interestingly enough, the very first individual, a wealthy tycoon and an individual very active on behalf of, quote, nationalist, translate fascist organizations, was a fellow named William Grace. And interestingly enough, a very, very good friend and longtime associate of William Grace was none other than Count Sergei de Mohrenschildt, George de Mohrenschildt, one of the Third Reich émigrés who we looked at in connection with President Kennedy's assassination. And it should be remembered that George de Mohrenschildt was a buddy of George Bush's and apparently worked in conjunction with Bush, certainly in relation to their mutual interest in operations in the petroleum industry, and quite possibly in connection with their work for the U.S. intelligence system as well. De Mohrenschildt hooked up with William Grace, and a hookup with William Grace was one of the things that in 1944 Kurt Riess had envisioned as a way of helping to bring fascism to America, or as a way, I should say, well, of bringing fascism to America, but as a way that the Third Reich might seek to perpetuate its influence. Interestingly enough, another organization that Kurt Riess sees as a likely target for Third Reich infiltration after World War II in order to rebuild fascism and Nazi Germany eventually was the American Vigilant Intelligence Federation of Harry A. Jung. That organization collaborated actively with the Hitler-Goebbels anti-Comintern that we looked at last week. That organization also provided the seed for the The American Security Council, a key element of the World Anti-Communist League, and an organization which was was central, I should say, to the milieu that we've been looking at, and instrumental in helping to promote the agenda of the anti-Bolshevik bloc of nations. We will be taking a look at the Kennedy Conspiracy by Paris Flammonde for documentation on the relationship between William Grace and George de Mohrenschildt. By the way, Grace's son, J. Peter Grace, a key member of the Sovereign Military Order of Malta, or Knights of Malta, that we looked at in Radio Free America programs 17 and 21, became a key functionary in Ronald Reagan's administration. He was, as far as I know, never a formal cabinet member, but he was part of the President's Council on Cutting Costs in Government. Also an individual who was very close to Otto Ambros. Otto Ambros was an IG Farben engineer and an individual who set up the slave labor camps at Auschwitz during World War II, and also developed the poison gas used to dispatch the victims of the Third Reich in those camps under the auspices of Hitler's final solution. We will review briefly the relationship, the seminal relationship between Harry Young's American Vigilant Intelligence Federation and the American Security Council, an organization that we looked at last week. By way of a transition to the next installment of Radio Free America 37, we are then going to take a look at a short section of the book Blowback by Christopher Simpson, and we're going to take a look at the relationship between the Office of Strategic Services Special Intelligence Branch and the Reinhard Gehlen Organization, and we will see in this hookup between the OSS's Special Intelligence Branch and Gehlen the development, the political genesis, and the national security genesis of a number of key people who have not only influenced the CIA, but also the American government and world affairs in the years since. People like Allen Dulles, the aforementioned William Casey, Frank Wisner, Richard Helms. All of these people were deeply involved with the OSS's Special Intelligence Branch, that, in turn, deeply involved with the organization of Reinhard Gehlen. And the Gehlen Organization is one of the central elements in this long and developing archive show. We will be looking at that next week. So that, in a nutshell, a coconut shell under the circumstances, is what we have on tap for this evening. I'm going to take a musical break, and then we're going to come back with the first installment of tonight's installment of Radio Free America program number 37, How the United States Lost the Second World War. We're going to begin now with the first installment, or not the first installment, with the beginning of tonight's installment of what is going to be a very large and important Radio Free America program, namely Radio Free America program number 37, How the United States Lost the Second World War. Now, I want to emphasize that the title of this program, although it might sound preposterous or pretentious to some of you, is in no way to be taken figuratively. When I say the United States lost the Second World War, I mean that absolutely literally. The Prussian military theoretician von Clausewitz had an oft-quoted observation that war is the continuation of politics by other means. You will also see that translated, war is the continuation of policy by other means. What we're going to be taking a look at during the course of the next several programs is how politics represents the continuation of war by other means. The multinational corporate community, and in studying the history of fascism, and in particular in examining how the U.S. came to lose the Second World War, and I mean it literally, it's important to understand that fascism is inextricably linked with the multinational corporate community. I've taken a look at that once again in the first two Radio Free America programs, Radio Free America program number 10, the Uncle Sam and the Swastika broadcast, Uncle Sam and Il Duce, and the miscellaneous archive show entitled Japanese Fascism, Its History and Significance for Contemporary Americans. All of those programs will document the inextricable link between multinational corporate capitalism and fascism. However, it should be understood, and I want to underscore very, very strongly this evening, that multinational community, that multinational corporate community, is by no means monolithic. The multinational corporate community, for our purposes here, and I think this is a valid analogy, could be compared with an organized crime syndicate. Even though organized crime organizations will cooperate with each other, at the same time there is rivalry, and sometimes that rivalry actually takes a deadly form. During the Second World War, even though many of the world's industrialists and financiers had actually hooked up with each other in cartel arrangements, and even though many of them agreed about the importance of fascism and supported it, yet at the same time there were competing interests. In particular, the United States and Japan were competing for empire in the Western Pacific. This resulted ultimately in the attack on Pearl Harbor and America's entry into the Second World War. This ultimately led to the United States being an enemy, at least for a few years, of Nazi Germany. And so I want to underscore that even though the multinational corporate community works together, there is active cooperation between multinational corporations of various countries. At the same time, they have and do they have historically and do compete with each other. And what we're going to be taking a look at during the course of this archive program, I guess you could say, is how the Berlin mob bested the Washington gang. And we're going to be taking a look at this evening at the development of the political milieu that we've been looking at in the past 2 weeks. That milieu, which was the milieu which executed a successful military coup in the United States on November 22nd, 1963, namely the assassination of President Kennedy. That milieu involved an intersection of the petroleum industry, the intelligence community, the Third Reich residua grouped around the Reinhard Gehlen intelligence organization and the interrelated anti-Bolshevik bloc of nations, the defense industry, the American far right, and the mainstream American political superstructure. Again, we've taken a look at that development, or that milieu, over the last 2 weeks. Bear in mind that George Bush was part and parcel to that milieu, whether or not he was involved in the assassination of President Kennedy, and there are indications that he may have been. He certainly appears to have helped to frustrate congressional investigations into aspects of the Kennedy assassination when he was Director of Central Intelligence. He was certainly connected to George de Mohrenschildt and may have been involved in some of the same intelligence operations de Mohrenschildt was apparently involved with while operating under the auspices of the petroleum industry, and George Bush may have been involved in the CIA's anti-Castro Cuban efforts in the early 60s. The CIA's anti-Castro Cuban milieu distinctly involved in the assassination of John Kennedy. Whether or not Bush was, as an article in the current issue of Covert Action Information Bulletin theorizes, deeply involved with the CIA, with the petroleum industry, and with the CIA's anti-Castro Cuban efforts, whether or not he was certainly inextricably linked with the milieu, this fascist milieu that we've been looking at. And it should be noted again, of course, that George Bush became Director of Central Intelligence. He's currently President of the United States, and the geopolitical goals first set by the Third Reich and later introduced into and adopted by the U.S. national security establishment came to fruition vis-a-vis Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, came to fruition on George Bush's watch. I personally do not think that is a coincidence. What we're going to be doing this evening, as I said, is taking a look. We're going to go all the way back to the Second World War to take a look at the development, the historical development of that milieu. We're going to be taking a look at how that milieu came into existence, because that is the milieu which, as I said, effected a successful military coup in 1963. It is the milieu which dominates the United States to this day. We're going to begin the program this evening by listening to a radio program, an American radio show from the closing months of World War II. And it should be noted again that this particular radio program might sound kind of dated to many of the listeners. Obviously, this is 1940s radio. It might sound a little bit corny or a little bit hammy, and even though you will get a chuckle perhaps at certain aspects of it, I want to underscore that the central points of information in this radio program are absolutely valid, and they are of enormous historical importance, enormous political importance. They are vital to our understanding of the historical development of the milieu, which is currently in control of the world's politics, which is currently in control of the United States, and which is currently in control of all of our lives. This radio show, I believe, goes for about 40 minutes. I will have to turn the cassette tape over at one point, so you will have to bear with me for a little bit of dead air. A cardinal sin in radio, but what the heck, you can't win them all. And so those of you who are taping tonight's program, get ready to tape. We're going to go back to the closing months of World War II, and we're going to listen to a radio program called High Command. It might sound a little bit silly, but as we're going to see, the historical and political truths underscored in this program are not only valid, but are vitally important to our understanding of the evolution, the development of the milieu, this fascist milieu that we have been looking at over the last 2 weeks, and which is central to Radio Free America 37. So we're now going to begin listening to High Command from the closing months of World War II.
4 for the 5th. Radio programs for the 5th War Loan, produced by Arch Oboler and William N. Robeson for the United States Treasury. And starring on this broadcast, Mr. Paul Lucas and Mr. Eric von Stroheim. This is a war not only of men and machines, but of ideas. As the second of this special series of broadcasts about the ideas for which we fight and those which we fight against, we present High Command, a radio document written and directed by William N. Robeson and starring Mr. Paul Lucas and Mr. Eric von Stroheim.
Can assume the position of a Napoleon.
The lance corporal is the house painter, the little man who chews rugs, the jerk with the toothbrush mustache and the delusions of grandeur, that character with the comedy name Schicklgruber, at whom we so often poked fun in those days when we were whistling to keep up our courage. But those words you just heard were not uttered by a brave radio commentator or a bellicose columnist based behind our eastern sea frontier. They were spoken to Hitler's face by the former commander-in-chief of the German army, Field Marshal Walter Heinrich Alfred Hermann von Brauchitsch.
The days are over when a lance corporal can assume the position of a Napoleon.
Of yesterday draws the picture of tomorrow. We'll examine that hand. We'll read that palm. But first, let's look at the picture. The scene is Berchtesgaden. You know Berchtesgaden, where der Führer consults his intuitions and issues his orders. The time is not far in the future. Next week, next month, certainly we hope by the end of this year. The characters:
Field Marshal von Rundstedt, Field Marshal von Bock, and Herr von Brauchitsch, mein Führer.
Von Brauchitsch? I dismissed him 2 years ago.
Nevertheless, he is here with the others.
Send them away.
That will be impossible, Adolf.
Why?
They are not unaccompanied.
What do you mean?
A battalion of the Reichswehr with them.
Where are my elite guards?
They have been relieved for the time being.
Treason! They dare to threaten me?
They say it is a protective measure. You have used the word many times, Führer.
Don't they remember how von Fritsch died in Poland? Doesn't von Brauchitsch remember what I did to him? Don't they know that with a single command I can have them all?
Their men surround the villa.
Show them in.
Gentlemen.
What is the meaning of this?
We represent the High Command.
The High Command? You? Where are my loyal generals? Where's Milch? Where's Rommel?
Trying to stop Eisenhower at the Rhine.
Where's Keitel?
Probably running away from the Russians in Poland.
And Kesselring can't hold the Brenner Pass for another 48 hours.
Sign this. What is it? Your resignation.
Or if you prefer, your abdication.
Traitors! Ragtag and bobtail of an outworn caste system. Worthless clowns! My intuitions. Why didn't I listen to my intuitions?
The same intuitions that made you attack Russia against our advice?
And sent 500,000 men to their death at Stalingrad?
Oh, ungrateful. Monstrous. When the German people hear of this...
The German people will take orders from the man who carries the gun.
History has never witnessed such perfidy.
Hitler, your knowledge of history is as inadequate as your intuition in military matters. In 1918, General Ludendorff was compelled to make the same demand of the Kaiser, and for the same reason.
United Nations will not make peace with you or the Nazi Party. Both must be liquidated at once.
And the High Command will be free to negotiate peace, which will leave our army intact and the Reich uninvaded, just as we did in 1918. We have lost nothing that we had when we started, and we will be strong enough to attack again in 25 years.
But we can do nothing as long as you remain as Reichsführer.
Hermann, my faithful friend, my old comrade, what shall I do?
What else can you do, Adolf?
Very well. When the Deutsches Reich calls, I, its humblest soldier, am willing to sacrifice everything.
Spare us the theatrics, Herr Hitler. You're fortunate to escape with your life.
Well, that's the silliest thing I ever heard in my life. John, don't you think that was silly?
Yeah, these radio plays. Propaganda. Another war in 25 years. Well, when we get through with the Germans this time, there won't be nothing left of them. Well, we're going to march right down the Underden Linden and hang Hitler to the nearest lamppost, if any of them are still standing. Why, we're...
Pardon me, please.
Huh?
Is this 1944 or 1918?
Huh?
I remember the same brave American words in 1918. Only it was the Kaiser you were going to hang. And I believe he was to be suspended from a sour apple tree.
Who are you?
I am a German. And you, I believe, are John Manstreet, American. And, pardon me, Mrs. Manstreet.
Oh, yeah, how'd you know?
We have a file on you and Mrs. Manstreet at the Ausland Institute in Stuttgart. The typical American and his wife interest us very much. Very much.
Who are you?
Just a German. You might say your opposite number. You could call me Herr Mannstrasse.
Are you a Nazi?
I am a good German.
Well, does that mean you're a Nazi?
Of course.
Then I don't want to have anything to do with you. Come on, Ray, let's get as far away from this guy.
Now, isn't that a typical American attitude? Hide your head in the sand. Walk away from the unpleasant. We Germans are different. What we like least, we learn the most about, so that we can defeat and conquer it.
For instance?
The United States of America, for instance.
Are you kidding? Listen, we beat the pants off you Heinies in 1918, and we're doing the same thing right now.
It gives me a great joy to hear you say that.
Why?
Because as long as you and your fellow citizens act and think as you did in 1918, we will win the war.
What?
Nonsense.
Just as we did in 1918.
Hey, now, wait a minute. Let me get this straight. You won the war in 1918?
Certainly.
Brother, I've been reading the wrong history books.
That's wholly possible. They concern themselves more with names and dates than with economics.
Economics? Well, we made you pay for that war. And you got in such a bad financial jam, we had to send our own experts over to straighten you out.
Yes, that's your side of the story. And don't forget the wave of Christian compassion that swept your country for poor, defeated Germany. You are such naive Dummkopf. Listen to the way Germany handles money. Listen to how your dollar diplomacy failed to work.
Germany must pay for the war.
Germany must pay to the last penny.
Germany must pay to the last sou. But how much? 40 billion.
75 billion.
120 billion.
How much? That was the question. How much for the leveled villages of France? How much for the hulls of British ships rusting on the bottom of the sea? How much is a dead Belgian baby worth? These men around the long green table are not sentimentalists. These are statesmen, lawgivers, practical men. This is the civilized world, victorious, sitting judgment on a beaten enemy. And you can't get blood out of a turnip, can you?
We'll settle for 15 billion.
It is too much. We can never pay. You gentlemen forget that we have fought a war on two fronts. We have bled white. The flower of our manhood is gone. Germany is beaten to the dust.
Sightless eyes of a million corpses weep dry tears for poor Germany. And the poppies bow in a breeze that whispers, scrap of paper, scrap of paper. In Berlin, the high command sits. The costumes have changed, but the characters are the same. Dressed in drab business suits, the Junkers still rule Germany. You know the names of some of them. Ludendorff, von Hindenburg, von Mackensen, and the junior officers, the ones who today command the armies of the Reich.
15 billions. It is better than I had hoped for.
The English are so civilized, and the Americans so sentimental. They will believe anything.
If they're willing to let us off for 15 billions, why should we pay them at all?
Precisely what I was thinking.
We will need every mark we can lay hands on to rearm.
It's an incredible story. Incredible that the Germans would attempt such a swindle. Incredible that we let them get away with it. Here are the shameful and shabby facts. These are some of the items we permitted the Germans to charge off against their reparations bill. Here's a padded expense account for you.
Item, the expenses of the Allied armies of occupation.
Item, the cost of demobilizing the German army. Item, the value of the Grand Fleet, which the Germans themselves had scuttled at Scapa Flow.
Although Germany is now saddled with an almost impossible reparation structure imposed by a revenge-seeking debt commission, there is no reason to believe that with help, German industry cannot stage a comeback. The plants still exist. The technical skills are there. We feel that German industry represents a real opportunity to the American investor.
Excellent. Excellent. This is only one of many, Mynheer. The financial pages of the American newspapers are filled with such stories.
They will respond. The American likes nothing better than 6% on the dollar.
We responded. So did the rest of the gullible, sentimental, civilized world. The details are too painful to enumerate. The disgraceful result was this.
When a moratorium was declared in 1931, Germany had paid out only $4.5 billion.
And had received in loans and investments $6.5 billion. Germany's profit from World War I, $2 billion.
So, you see, we really won the war.
But it's unbelievable.
It is true, though.
That double-crossing Hitler?
Ah, Mr. Mansfield, you do the Führer an injustice. We managed to solve the reparations problem before he came into power. You see, we managed to convince you that the only way your investments could be saved was by canceling reparations. And you persuaded England and France to declare the moratorium. We are grateful to you for that. And for your gift of several $1 billion.
What do you mean?
The American investments in Germany. Naturally, as soon as he came into power, the Führer canceled them.
What?
Oh, yes. We built quite a few submarines and planes and tanks with your money. Of course, Hitler gets too much credit these days.
If you can call it credit. He thought up this jive about the master race, didn't he?
Oh, my, no. Hitler is merely the contemporary expression of German supremacy. The plan existed long before Hitler.
We have proved from history the characteristics of the Germans as an original people and as a people that has the right to call itself simply the people.
Those words describing the rights of the master race were written long before Hitler, more than 100 years ago, by Johann Gottlieb Fichte.
Between states, there is no right or might except that of the stronger. A state, even when on the very point of making war, should solemnly assert its love of peace and aversion to conquest.
Theory? The words of a musty philosopher? Distant echoes from an ancient ivory tower? Listen.
The German people have no thoughts of invading any country.
Hitler in 1933.
The assertions of the German Reich plans to coerce the Austrian state is absurd and cannot be substantiated.
Hitler in 1934.
Germany has concluded a non-aggression pact with Poland, which is more than a valuable contribution to European peace. And she will adhere to it unconditionally.
Hitler in 1935.
We have no territorial demands to make in Europe.
1936, the year the Rhineland was reoccupied.
We have assured all of our immediate neighbors of the integrity of their territory as far as Germany is concerned. That is no hollow phrase. It is our secret will.
1938, the year of the Anschluss, the invasion of Austria.
We have but one wish, that in the coming year we may be able to make our contribution to this general pacification of the whole world.
The Führer in 1939, the year we seized Czechoslovakia and invaded Poland.
Even when on the very point of making war, assert love of peace, aversion to conquest.
You see how well we Germans learn our lessons?
War is the only fit instrument for the achievement of a political policy.
Who's shooting off his face now?
General von Clausewitz. More than 100 years ago, he foresaw total war.
Violence arms itself with the inventions of art and science.
He foresaw blitzkrieg.
An attack directed to the destruction of the enemy which has not the boldness to shoot like the point of an arrow direct at the heart of the enemy's power can never hit the mark.
This we have proved in Poland, Norway, Holland, France, and Belgium.
Yeah, how about Russia?
A mistake of the Führer, not of the High Command.
And England?
An island of little importance. Clausewitz teaches us to strike at the heart of the enemy's power. We know now that means Detroit, Pittsburgh, Dallas, Baltimore. Oh, yes. You will become the slaves of the master race. If not in this war, then in the next.
Oh, but we're fighting this war, so there won't be any more wars.
Precisely the reason why you fought the last one. And while you piddle in such democratic and utopian dreams, while you mouth your puking for freedoms, we live by stern realities. Here is truth. Here are the words of Heinrich von Fritzsche.
War is just and moral, and the ideal of eternal peace is both unjust and immoral and impossible. God will see to it that war shall return again. Every sovereign state has the unquestionable right to declare war when it so desires, and therefore it is possible for every state to cancel its treaty.
If that's your racket, I don't see why nations go on doing business with you. Why don't they get wise?
Why? Well, my American friend, one of your countrymen explained it very simple. P.T. Barnum, I believe his name was, a regisseur of some note. Remember? There is a sucker born every minute.
Oh, yeah? Well, another American said, you can fool all of the people some of the time, and you can fool some of the people all the time. But you can't fool all the people all the time.
I wonder, Mr. Manstreet. I wonder. Our Führer has always insisted on telling big lies. He believes that the bigger the lie, the more people will believe at least some of it. It is a very efficient system. Look how well it works in your country.
Well, what do you mean?
The lies you believe about your Jews and Negroes and Mexicans and Catholics. All your minorities. We've had to plan those lies. And after this war is over, we will see to it that your tensions, your hatreds, and prejudice are kept alive. It will make you so much softer when we attack you again.
Why are you telling us all this?
Because you won't believe it.
Listen, chum, there isn't going to be any next time. You've had 2 tries at this world domination racket, and when we get through with you this time, you'll be through.
Ah, but you have a saying, the third time is the charm.
There isn't going to be any third time, I tell you.
Those are brave words now. But do you soft-hearted and sentimental Americans, know what your invasion will cost? Will you be able to bear page after page of your newspapers filled with the list of your dead? Do you think your sentimentalists will be silent then? Even now, your country is divided. Your East Coast is at war with us, but your West Coast thinks only of the war with Japan. And in between, isn't it true that your people in the Middle West are sick and tired of the war? You've gone without gasoline and rubber tires, and you've scrimped on shoes and liquor, and all of you are pretty fed up, aren't you? You are grumbling, and we know. We helped to start the grumble, and now you are trying to attack us on our own ground. You are trying to invade, and you are going to lose hundreds of thousands of your finest young men. For what? You are going to ask yourself. Peace now, your brown-tongued orators will bellow. No foreign entanglement. Get the boys home by Christmas. What's left of them, your mothers will plead. We know you Americans. Germany is counting on you.
The scene is Berchtesgaden again. The time is in a not-too-distant future. And a few minutes after Herr Hitler has been permitted to flee to the sanctuary of one of those neutral countries which still refuses to distinguish between political refugees and global criminals. The characters, the High Command, the same old gang. Their grandfathers unified Germany and crowned Wilhelm I emperor in Versailles in 1871. Their fathers made the deal at Compiègne in 1918. And as their fathers did then, they have just fired their front man. The German High Command, which has ruled Germany for nearly a century, carries on.
Well, gentlemen, now we can get down to business. What are your feelings about peace terms?
The policy we followed in 1919 will do admirably now. Object to everything, cry poverty, and play upon world sympathy.
We are in a much better position now than we were then. The machinery, the art treasures. Now we have the loot of all Europe.
Of course, you realize they will push us back to our old borders. We will probably even lose Austria for the time being.
That's all right. What good is France or Poland or Norway to anyone now? What are the latest figures on Poland, von Barth?
Oh, I've lost count, General. We must certainly have annihilated at least 3 million Poles and Jews, and a great percentage of the young women have been sterilized. There's not much danger of Poland breeding a generation of fighting men in the next 25 years.
How about France, von Rundstedt?
Well, you know Hitler has had 1.5 million Frenchmen in prison camps and labor battalions since 1940. They're worthless as fathers now. And in France itself, we've managed to increase the death rate over the birth rate. The children that are still alive are quite worthless. Starvation is so much more effective than machine guns, especially with the young. We agreed before this war began that our great mistake in 1918 was to spare the civilians of enemy countries. We agreed that it would be necessary to destroy at least 1/3 of the inhabitants of occupied territories. I believe I can safely say that this has been done.
There's no doubt about it.
Good, good. Now, here within the Reich, I think it will be advisable to continue with the sex freedom introduced by Herr Hitler. We must breed a sufficient number of strong young men so that in 25 years we will be in a position to resume our campaign for world domination.
We'll have to go carefully with that. We'll need the sanction of the church for the next few years.
Don't worry. There are ways. Nudism and strength through joy were very successful before. You can always describe license as freedom and modernism.
I don't think that it's too early to review the mistakes we made this time and to face the hard facts of our present position. The United States is now the greatest sea power in the world, yet even the British Navy alone kept us from invading England. We must build a great navy this time.
You think they will let us?
They forbade us to rearm before, but we found a way then. We will find a way now. But there is one mistake we must not make again.
What is that, General?
That was the fundamental error we made this time. We should have realized from the first that the United States would be the heart of Anglo-Saxon power.
Then the United States must be defeated the next time.
Certainly. The unpleasant truth is, gentlemen, no nation can hope for world domination unless it controls the vast resources of the United States.
Agreed.
Our strategy must be directed toward America.
And doubly intensified. We must not make mistakes.
Rogers stuff.
You can't get away with that in this day and age.
You don't have to take my word for it. Just read your own newspapers. Right-hand column, page 3, New York Times of May 26th. An Associated Press dispatch from London, dated May 31st. The 3-column story on page 5 in the New York Post of February 5th. Page 51 on Life magazine for May 8th. Our plans are not secret.
That's a lot of propaganda.
The Führer said the bigger the lie, the more likely it is to be believed. But you, Mr. and Mrs. Mansfield, prove another axiom.
Huh?
What?
The bigger the unpleasant truth, the less likely it is to be believed in America.
Ladies and gentlemen, you have just heard Mr. Paul Lucas and Mr. Erich von Stroheim in High Command, a radio document written and directed by William N. Robeson, with an original musical score composed and conducted by Wilbur Hatch. And now, a word from Mr. Paul Lucas.
Ladies and gentlemen, the words and sentiments which I expressed in the part I have just played are as loathsome to me, a naturalized American citizen, as I know they are to you who are native born. But these words had to be said. These ideas had to be exposed. All of us must realize that there still exists on this globe, and will continue to exist, unless we are extremely careful, a group of ruthlessly clever and utterly unscrupulous men who are plotting a future of humiliation and slavery for us and for our children. This is not an hysterical overstatement. We are not viewing with undue alarm. What you have heard is sober fact, authenticated and documented many times over. Now, this cancer must be eliminated. This virus must be killed. This war must be prosecuted until it ends in the unconditional surrender of the German people, the Nazi Party, and the dangerous murderers who control them both, the German High Command. Now, your part in this campaign for the extinction of evil is simple and clear.
Back the attack by more than before.
Well, folks, that concludes that particular radio program. Again, High Command. And certainly that will appear to be a little bit ridiculous to the average listener. The stylistic considerations of 1940s radio will perhaps maximize that particular reaction, but it should be underscored that the political realities that were described in that program are absolutely real. Note, too, the discussion by the character played by Paul Lucas of the role of American-based multinational corporations in helping to rebuild Germany after World War I. I went into that at considerable length in Uncle Sam and the Swastika, as well as the first two Radio Free America shows. And again, it is to be understood that the events that I am and the forces that I am focusing on in this archive show, How the United States Lost the Second World War, are in no way to be viewed as existing in a vacuum. Far from it. The very formation of the political milieu that we looked at last week and the week before, an explicitly fascist milieu which assumed the seat of power in the United States on November 22nd, 1963, is inextricably linked with the forces of multinational corporate capitalism, and that should in no way be forgotten during the course of this long program. Again, this is going to be done in several installments. Also, I want to emphasize that this is in no way to be interpreted as anti-German or to be condemning of the average German citizen. What I'm looking at is a broad-based historical reality. Indeed, fascism is in no way, as I have tried to emphasize over the years, a phenomenon that was limited to Germany or Japan or Italy. On the contrary, the phenomenon of fascism grew directly out of multinational corporate capitalism. And what we're looking at in this long archive show, as I said, is how one faction of the organized crime syndicate of multinational corporate capitalism has come into ascendance. How, I guess you could say, the Berlin mob came to dominate the Washington gang and the London syndicate. We're going to be taking a look, after a very short musical break, at some hard printed documentation of many of the things that were discussed in that radio program. And this, again, is by way of looking at the historical development of the milieu which took over on 11/22/63, which is in control of the world today, and which has brought about a world political and economic reality which is very much in tune with what Adolf Hitler sought to bring about through the Second World War. It has been said by some American power politicians and journalists that the 20th century was the American century. Well, the 21st century, folks, is going to be the German century, and we're going to take a look at how that came about. It should also be noted, too, that, as I said, von Clausewitz, whom you heard quoted, or someone reading his words, von Clausewitz said that war is the continuation of politics by other means. Due to the advent of nuclear weapons, the Third World War, which the German General Staff and the Nazi Party was planning, could not be conducted in the way that they might have envisioned in the 1940s. Frontal warfare as such became obsolete with the enormous destructive power of nuclear weapons. But what we are going to be looking at is a transmutation of von Clausewitz's principle, we're going to be taking a look at politics as the continuation of war by other means. And next week and in weeks after that, we're going to take a look at the Gehlen Organization, how it literally represented a Trojan horse in the United States, and how it was able to affect American policy in such a way as to bring about a world political reality, a new world order, as Citizen Bush has put it, which is far more conducive to German interests than to American. And again, I want to emphasize that among the realities which are bearing down upon us at the moment is the coming of fascism to America. The assassination of President Kennedy, as we shall see, in an historical sense, represented three major developments. It represented the resolution of a constitutional struggle between the military and the executive branch. The American military had never liked the idea of having a civilian commander-in-chief. It represented the triumph of rollback or liberation theory of fighting the Cold War as opposed to containment theory, and it represented the ascendance of fascism in America. After a musical break, we're going to go back and we're going to take a look at just exactly how the forces which assumed power on 11/22/63 developed. Music and then more of tonight's program. We're now going to resume with this installment of Radio Free America number 37, How the United States Lost the Second World War. And what we're doing, as I've indicated a number of times this evening, is we are taking a look at the historical development of the explicitly fascist milieu that we've looked at in our first two installments. That milieu came into ascendance with the assassination of President Kennedy, not only in the United States, but as we shall see in weeks to come, the world as a whole. But in order to understand how this came into being, we are going to be going back to the Second World War itself. Now, in the radio broadcast, High Command, that you heard, and granted, it may have sounded a trifle corny due to the aesthetics of 1940s radio, there were some very, very important political truths expressed, and one of the most important of those truths is that the German political vision, the vision not only of the German General Staff and the industrialists that they represented, but also the vision of the Nazi Party, the political vision went way beyond simply the waging of one war. On the contrary, their plans for ascendance on the world stage were based on a broad concept of historical and political operation, one which encompassed the successful integration of the actions, both military and political, of decades. And once again, I want to reiterate the observation of Prussian military theoretician von Clausewitz, who observed that war was the continuation of politics or policy by other means. You'll see it translated both ways. Well, the reverse is true also. Politics is the continuation of war by other means, and in the Cold War, that is what we have seen. We're going to be looking at, for much of the broadcast this evening, a little-known but very, very important book that was written in 1944, the same year that you heard that broadcast from. The book is called The Nazis Go Underground, and it was authored by Kurt Riess, last name R-I-E-S-S. The book, as I said, was copyrighted in hardcover it was published, I should say, in 1944, copyrighted in hardcover by Doubleday, Duran and Company of New York City. Kurt Riess was a very important and very brilliant anti-fascist writer whose works, like those of so many of his contemporaries, were submerged in the McCarthy period in the early 1950s, and we're going to be taking a look at the McCarthy period, how it grew up, and the implications of that later on in this archive program. Among Kurt Riess's other books were Total Espionage, Underground Europe, The Self-Betrayed, and The Invasion of Germany. A very important writer, but one whose works tragically have not survived to the extent that they deserve to survive. And in The Nazis Go Underground, Kurt Riess details how the German General Staff had a broad-based concept of conquest, one which encompassed the successful actions of decades, and a program which necessitated the integration of both political and military action. Kurt Riess writes in The Nazis Go Underground, and again, he's speaking 1944, Even today, while World War II is still being fought, the more realistic German generals are discussing what must be done to prepare a new war. In November of 1943, the Algerian weekly Combat, C-O-M-B-A-T, published a few remarks of these generals. General Otto von Stuelpnagel even composed a lengthy memorandum on the war to come. This was obviously before World War II. That man's last name, S-T-U-E-L-P-N-A-G-E-L. He wrote, quote, "What does a provisional defeat matter to us if, because of the destruction of manpower and materiel which we will have been able to inflict on our enemies and neighboring territories, we have obtained a margin of economic and demographic superiority greater than before 1939. I would interject that as a result of the Second World War, even though Germany was formally militarily defeated, it had suffered far less damage to its heavy industry than its neighbors and did not experience the demographic reduction, the reduction in population, that many of the countries which fell before its armies did. Continuing, the conquest of the world will require numerous stages, but the essential is that the end of each stage brings us an economic and industrial potential greater than that of our enemies. With the war booty which we have accumulated, the enfeebling of 2 generations of the manpower, the destruction of the industries of our neighbors, and that which we can save of our own, we shall be better placed to conquer in 25 years than we were in 1939. The interval of 25 years is a limited interval, for that is the time which will be required for Russia to repair the destruction we have visited on her." Now, obviously, this was during the war. I correct myself. Continuing, that last sentence again. The interval of 25 years is a limited interval, for that is the time which will be required for Russia to repair the destruction we have visited on her. We do not have to fear peace conditions analogous to those which we have imposed, because our adversaries will always be divided and disunited. Our enemies recognize already that the 1920 formula, "Germany will pay," unquote, lacked sense and worth. We will furnish them some brigades of workers, we will restore some art objects or out-of-date machines, and we can always say that those which we do not restore were destroyed by enemy bombardments. We should immediately prepare as camouflage a list of such objects destroyed by Anglo-American bombs. Marshal von Rundstedt made a speech in the War Academy in Berlin in which he argued along much the same line. Quote, "The destruction of our neighboring people and their riches is indispensable to our victory. One of the great mistakes of 1918 was to spare the civil life of the enemy countries, for it is necessary for us Germans to be always at least double the number of peoples of contiguous countries. We are therefore obliged to destroy at least a third of their inhabitants. The only means is organized underfeeding, which in this case is better than machine guns." I would also note, too, a fact which has largely been overlooked is that at the end of the Second World War, German heavy industry, which as we've looked at in the first 2 Radio Free America shows, Uncle Sam and the Swastika and others, was deeply involved with American industry and finance. German heavy industry was largely intact at the end of the Second World War. Some plants had been bombed, and some of those plants were then paid for by or the multinational corporations that owned them were compensated by the American government. But it should be noted that the German economy in the Second World War was crippled as a result of Allied air forces knocking out 2 basic elements, knocking out rolling stock and road traffic. Allied fighter bombers, chiefly American, were able to interdict both German rail and road traffic to an enormous extent, thereby preventing key war material from reaching the armies at the front, and beyond that, fuel, without which no transportation can take place. The German fuel-making capacity was interdicted as well. The decisive air battle vis-a-vis German industry in the Second World War was what has become known as the Battle of Leuna. That's spelled L-E-U-N-A, I'm not sure of the pronunciation, but the enormous IG Farben synthetic fuel processing plant at Leuna was repeatedly attacked by the U.S. 8th Army Air Force. Even though the Germans themselves were able to keep the plant in operation, the damage was so extensive that in order to keep this vital fuel synthesizing facility open, the Germans had to cannibalize so many of their other gasoline synthesizing plants or oil synthesizing plants that their capacity to synthesize oil became simply inadequate for their war needs. I would note that, as I documented in Uncle Sam and the Swastika, the hydrogenation process by which Germany was able to synthesize oil from coal was developed by the Germans, and the Standard IG Agreement of 1929 provided them with the capital to compensate them for that particular production. It also guaranteed that the Germans would be able to use the hydrogenation process to manufacture fuel in Germany only, thereby protecting Standard Oil of New Jersey's worldwide operations from the potential commercial threat of synthesized oil. It should also be noted again that IG Farben acquired 2% of Standard of New Jersey's stock, thereby becoming the second largest holder in Standard Oil of New Jersey, behind the Rockefeller family. IG Farben, of course, the massive German chemical and fuel cartel of the Second World War, the backbone of Nazi war production. But again, it should be noted that German heavy industry was largely intact at the end of the war. Some plants were destroyed, but the German economy, the German war economy, was brought to a halt by interdicting the capacity to transport manufactured goods to the armies at the front. Again, rail and road traffic were interdicted by Allied fighter bombers, and their fuel-making capacity was neutralized by strategic bombardment, the Battle of Leuna being the key element in that particular campaign. So the rebuilding of German industry was relatively easy at the end of the war, and as we looked at in Uncle Sam and the Swastika, U.S. industry and finance, the same industrialists and financiers that had collaborated with the Third Reich, and many of those industrialists and financiers were ardently pro-fascist, others were simply interested in profits. They saw to it that the same industrial and financial concerns which backed Hitler were put back in power at the end of World War II. Next, when we're going to stick with The Nazis Go Underground by Kurt Riess, what we're going to look at now is how the German General Staff began planning for defeat. They had seen their military defeat coming in October of 1941, and they formally met to begin making plans for that defeat on December 9th, 1941, 2 days after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Now, it should be noted in this regard that the German General Staff's plans to defeat the Soviet Union called for a blitzkrieg. It called for lightning war. The Germans had no capacity to winter, or had not envisioned that they would have to winter inside of the Soviet Union. That is, the German armies they met unexpected resistance. They were not able to keep to their timetable. By October 15th of 1941, the Germans realized that they may very well lose the war. And by December 9th of 1941, with Japan having attacked the United States, and with the United States inevitably going to enter the war against Germany, the German generals realized that they were going to lose World War II. At this point, the Red Army had begun a counteroffensive before Moscow against the German armies, and beyond that, from a strategic standpoint, the Germans stood to fight China, which was on the Allied side, the most populous nation in the world, the Soviet Union, which was the second most populous independent nation of the world and a major manufacturing power. India, it should be noted, now an independent country and the second most populous nation on Earth, was part of the British Empire, which obviously was also fighting the Axis powers. The Soviet Union, obviously, was fighting against the Axis, and on December 7th, 1941, the United States, the third most populous independent country in the world and an enormous manufacturing power, came into the war, or its entry into the war on the side of the Allies was made inevitable. So the Germans, in December of 1941, saw themselves fighting the combined population and manufacturing capacity of the British Empire, including India. The Axis powers had to fight China, the most populous nation on Earth, the Soviet Union, the second most populous independent nation and a major manufacturing power, and the United States, the third most populous nation and an enormous manufacturing power. The Germans realized that they were going to lose, and it's worth noting that by December, again, of 1941, the German generals were beginning to plan for a temporary defeat, but to reconstitute for the broad-based conquest which was outlined in the speeches or in the statements of Generals von Stumpnagel and von Rundstedt, which I outlined above, or which I read above. Now, we're going to take a look at General Werner von Brauchitsch, the general whom you heard dramatized in that particular radio show. That's the von Brauchitsch which we see here. By the way, that's his last name, Brauchitsch. Kurt Reese writes, "Von Brauchitsch was not a general of great vision, but he was a man who could judge a military situation when he saw one, and he could retain his judgment even in the face of the impressive advances the German army had made in Russia during the first 4 months. He had a good memory. He remembered the spectacular advances of General von Kluck's First Army in August of 1914, that's K-L-U-C-K. The young Brauchitsch had been a liaison officer in that army. He remembered in what an unbelievably short time the Germans had rushed to the Marne and the Ourcq, that's M-A-R-N-E and capital O-U-R-C-Q. And then came the defeat at the Marne, and the war was lost, although it took 4 more years to establish this accomplished fact. Brauchitsch could not be deceived by impressive partial successes. He knew that the timetable for the conquest of the Soviet Union had not been kept, that the Russian army had by no means been crushed, that it had by no means been prevented from deploying, all of which meant that the war would not be over before the Russian winter would set in, and Brauchitsch knew that the German army was not equipped to spend a Russian winter fighting. Therefore, Brauchitsch was in favor of a retreat. On October 15th, now this is 1941, he had called a meeting of his outstanding generals to talk things over. However, the meeting did not develop according to his expectations. Hitler dropped in unexpectedly. The generals all agreed with von Brauchitsch. They were unanimous in their belief that the offensive should be discontinued in the face of the ever-increasing strength of the Russian army and the approaching winter. Field Marshal von Bock, B-O-C-K, even proposed a withdrawal of some 200 miles. Hitler objected violently. He had no intention of going back. He had every intention of going on with the war and of attacking a handful of other countries in the near future. He did not want to lose his newly acquired prestige as a military genius. A heated discussion ensued, and harsh words were exchanged between some of the generals, particularly Herr von Bock and Hitler's private advisors whom he had brought along. But nothing definite was decided upon. 6 weeks later, Brauchitsch knew that he had been right. The Russian army had begun its first counteroffensive. The winter in Russia was now a dead certainty. On top of it all, on December 7th, Japan had declared war on the United States, and it was only a question of days, perhaps hours, till Germany and America would be at war too. Such was the situation when Brauchitsch met his generals once more on December 9th, 1941. That date may become historic, for it was on this day that the generals admitted quite openly to each other that the war could no longer be won, or as one of them put it, quote, "The Third Reich has lost the war," unquote. And the others said it in other words, all of them, von Bock, von Rundstedt, von Lieb, L-E-E-B, von Kleist, K-L-E-I-S-T, von Manstein, M-A-N-N-S-T-E-I-N, and the Chief of Staff, General Halder, H-A-L-D-E-R. It was then that Brauchitsch decided to resign as Commander-in-Chief, and that the others decided to decline to take over his job, and with it the responsibility for the war if the Fuhrer should offer it to them. All of which meant that the generals, although well aware that the war was lost for Germany, had every intention of surviving it themselves. The generals intended to save themselves till after the war, because thus, and only thus, could they hope to save the army, or what was the same thing, to maintain conditions favorable to a rebuilding of the army. It was on this December 9th, 1941, that they decided on the course they should take. They knew that there was ample time to accomplish their plan before the final defeat, but they did not intend to be surprised as they had been surprised in 1918. What could they do? What kind of preparations could they make? They could demonstrate to Germany and to the world at large that they had nothing to do with the planning of this war, that they could not be blamed for anything except for having done their duty as soldiers. They were worlds apart from that man Hitler, who was the only person to be blamed. I would interject at this point, too, that one of the things which permitted, to a large extent, the survival of elements of the Third Reich after the formal defeat of Nazi Germany was what is known as the Führerprinzip, the notion that at the top, sort of the top of a pyramid, was Hitler, and that everyone else was simply following orders. This permitted the rationalization of no moral guilt for those who had collaborated with Hitler. It was a rationale which the Allies bought to a considerable extent. A few of the top Nazis were executed, a few were jailed. Most of them were simply either given a wrist slap, or, as in the case of many of the SS intelligence and military people, incorporated not only into the Gehlen organization, but through that into the U.S. national security establishment and into a primary position of power in the post-World War II world. Gehlen we will come to next week. It should be noted that the German army did indeed begin to make plans to rebuild, and this as early as March of 1942, continuing with The Nazis Go Underground by Kurt Ries. Some of them, including von Rundstedt and von Bach, met again on March 10, 1942 in the Army Ministry in Berlin. They decided to create certain cadre or organizations most necessary to rebuilding the army in the future. This preparatory work was to be done through Department A4, a branch of the Auslandsabteilung of the War Ministry, and the Demobilization Department of the General Staff. The work in Department A4 was entrusted to Major General Werner Graberg, G-R-A-B-E-R-G, while that in the Demobilization Department was handed over to Colonel Richard Delius, D-E-L-I-U-S. In addition to those two men, they called upon General George Thomas, T-H-O-M-A-S, one of Goering's most intimate collaborators who had a post in the Ministry of Economics. Thomas, of whom it had been said repeatedly that he had resigned, was considered one of the most brilliant minds dealing with economic problems in Germany. So indeed, and by the way, I would emphasize something I would add something I did not mention as we began moving into the Kurt Ries book. This book is in large measure based not only on journalistic accounts, but also intelligence accounts from underground organizations within Europe as the Allies advanced. Just as the German generals had envisioned their own defeat as early as December of 41, even October, the Nazi Party itself, although lagging somewhat behind the German generals, the Nazi Party itself, after the Battle of Stalingrad, which concluded in February of 1943, began making concerted plans to go underground and to prepare for the post-World War II political realities, and once again to continue to proceed with the war, continue with war as politics, or continuation of politics as war by other means, turning around what von Clausewitz said. Of the Nazi Party's plans to go underground, which were formally put into effect on May 16th of 1943, Kurt Ries writes as follows. The Nazis went underground on May 16th, 1943. Before that day, there had been many weeks of preliminary and preparatory work done mainly inside the so-called Gestapo building in the Prinz Albrechtstrasse, Berlin, where Himmler had his headquarters on the second floor. But on May 16th, the real work began. On that day, those who were in charge of it moved to a spacious house, almost a little chateau, at 11 Königsallee in Berlin-Grunewald. That's K-O-E-N-I-G-S-A-L-L-E. Grunewald is G-R-U-N-E-W-A-L-D. Continuing. The whole estate, which had once belonged to a Jewish banker and had been taken over by the Nazis before the outbreak of the war, comprised more than a square mile. The rebuilt house contained large rooms on the first floor and a number of small offices on the second floor. The left wing of the main building was occupied by General Werner Heissmeyer of the SS, and his staff, the right wing, by General Fritz Kaltenbrunner of the SS. Heissmeyer, H-E-I-S-S-M-E-Y-E-R, Kaltenbrunner, K-A-L-T-E-N-B-R-U-N-N-E-R. In the large, well-kept garden that surrounded the house, some of the old trees had been cut off to make room for small office bungalows. The archives were stored in a bomb-proof cellar. I quote from a report, quote, "It was the intelligence department of the Gestapo which moved to 11 Königsallee on May 15th and 16th. From May 16th on, the intelligence department of the Gestapo was split into two parts. About half of the officials went on as usual in the Prinz Albrechtstrasse. The rest worked in Königsallee under Heissmeyer and Kaltenbrunner. Albrechtstrasse is A-L-B-R-E-C-H-T-S-T-R-A-S-S-E. Continuing. Strange orders began to issue from 11 Königsallee during the following weeks, most of them unintelligible to those who received them. It was, for instance, decreed that certain units within a certain government department should be dissolved and that other new units should be formed in other departments. Minor officials were suddenly transferred into departments for which they had never worked. From September of 1943 on, these strange orders increased. Some important departments were suddenly dissolved or completely reorganized, or merged with other departments. All these orders were signed by Heinrich Himmler, who had by then become General Plenipotentiary of the Reich. At 11 Königsallee, everyone worked feverishly. They had better means for preparing to go underground than any other potential underground movement in the entire previous history of the world. That last sentence again, because it's a key one. They had better means for preparing to go underground than any other potential underground movement in the entire previous history of the world. They had all the machinery of the well-organized Nazi state, and they had a great deal of time to prepare everything. They worked very hard, but they did nothing hastily, left nothing to chance. Everything was thought through thoroughly and logically and organized to the last detail. Himmler planned with the utmost coolness. He chose for the work only the best qualified experts, the best qualified, that is, in matters of underground work. What exactly does it mean to go underground? It means that a person, or a number of persons, a unit, a force, an idea, a movement that had been visible before, becomes invisible. It is no longer represented to the outside world. It has become anonymous. Its existence is known only by the effects of its actions. To go underground is for a single person, and even more so for a large number of persons, first of all, a question of organization. The Nazis had always been very fond of, and very good at, organization. And as we're going to see, the principal element involved in the underground transition of the German National Socialist Workers' Party, the NSDAP, the Nazi Party, was to lie with the SS and the Gestapo of Heinrich Himmler, and as we will see next week, that SS and that Gestapo played a critical role in the Gehlen organization, but when it was part of the U.S. intelligence apparatus and when it jumped to Germany. Of the SS and the Gestapo and its pivotal role in the coming Nazi underground movement, and in particular of Heinrich Himmler's deep study of the history of underground movements, Kurt Riess writes as follows in The Nazis Go Underground. The preparatory work, then, had to be centralized, but there was some question as to where this centralization should be done. Should it be entrusted to one of Bormann's organizations, the Verbindungsstab, the liaison staff of the Führer, for instance, the machinery for which had been built by Hess and in which key men of all party and state organizations were represented? The Verbindungsstab is Verbindungssstab. Continuing. Some of the Nazis were of the opinion that this might be an excellent idea. However, by the end of April, or at the latest by the beginning of May of 1943, the Gestapo, that is one of Himmler's organizations, was definitely put in charge of the entire preparatory work for the Nazi underground after the war. There were several reasons for this move. Perhaps one of the main reasons was that Himmler, by dint of constantly simplifying his organization and increasing its efficiency, had brought it to such a state of perfection that by now the Gestapo had become by far the best organized machine within the Third Reich, a fact which would facilitate the work considerably, while Bormann had hardly changed the much less streamlined organizations which Hess had left him. It was probably the hope that Himmler's great talent in organizing would work miracles which finally got him the job. But perhaps it was also the fact that Himmler wanted it, and the police minister could be strangely persistent when he wanted something for himself. The world knows a great deal about Heinrich Himmler, and still, it knows very little. He has chiefly been known all over the world, and particularly inside Germany and the occupied countries, as the cruel police chief of the Third Reich. So much so that Dr. Goebbels decided by the end of 1943 to distribute 4 million picture postcards showing a smiling Himmler talking to children in order to prove that he is a human being, even as you and I. But there are many sides to Himmler of which very few people have ever heard. Scarcely more than a few dozen men, for instance, have ever known anything about Himmler the scholar. The evidence of his particular study was probably destroyed on November 23, 1943, when British bombs laid in ruins the building in the Prinz Albrechtstrasse. Himmler's rooms contained a small but extremely specialized private library consisting entirely of books dealing with the subject of underground movements. There were volumes on the intrigues of the Bourbons since 1789, on the Bonaparte movement after 1815, on what happened in Prussia between 1806 and 1812. There were Kotzebue's works on the history of German orders, the writing of Lenin and Trotsky on the organization of underground movements, and those of Dzerzhinsky, the first efficient police organizer of the Bolsheviks, as well as books on the Ku Klux Klan, the Irish revolutionary movements, the German Free Corps, and FEMA organizations of the early 1920s, etc. Spellings, by the way, Kotzebue is K-O-T-Z-E-B-U-E, Dzerzhinsky is D-J-E-R-S-H-I-N-S-K-Y. Continuing. That was what Heinrich Himmler had been interested in for a long time. Underground movements of revolutionary character, underground movements of forces and personalities who had been deprived of power and wanted to stage a comeback. All these books most undoubtedly have influenced Himmler, and thus they will influence the future strategy of the Nazi underground. Germans are fond of thinking and acting in historical parallels. So again, one of the central points of the last couple of passages, remember now, the German General Staff making plans for their post-World War II revival on December 9th, 1941. The Nazi Party itself was going underground by May 16th of 1943, and that coming underground movement to have been built around and executed by the Gestapo and SS. I would note, too, that what that means is for the last 2 years of World War II, the Third Reich was fighting what is known in military terms as a rearguard action. They were conducting a military defense for the purposes of effecting an orderly and successful retreat so that they might fight again. Only, obviously, with the advent of nuclear weapons, the possibility of open frontal warfare became obsolete. However, once again, politics is the continuation of war by other means, as we pervert slightly, von Clausewitz, and that is what the Third Reich, in particular in the person of the Gehlen organization, was able to do. We will come to that next week. One of the most important methodological and theoretical considerations to understand as we begin looking at this early history of the development of the historical forces which formed the milieu that we looked at the last 2 weeks, and that milieu came into ascendance in Dealey Plaza in Dallas, Texas on 11/22/63. In understanding how the United States lost the Second World War, one must comprehend that one of the major strategic breakthroughs that the Germans, both the German General Staff and the industrialists whom they represented, and the Nazi Party itself, including the SS and Gestapo, they learned that communism, or the threat of communism / Bolshevism, could be used in a very effective way to promote and guarantee their own survival and perpetuation. What we're going to look at now is how the German Revolution, which took place at the end of World War I, permitted the German General Staff not only to remain in place, but to successfully perpetuate the German army. Now, once again, in Radio Free America program number 10, and in a miscellaneous archive show about the FEMA and the origins of the Nazi Party, we dealt with the German Revolution and some of its consequences for the politics that followed. There was in Germany, in particular in Bavaria and some of the Baltic states, during the closing days of World War I, an abortive Marxist revolution, much as had taken place in the former Russian Empire in 1917. Many of the workers and soldiers of Germany revolted and set up workers and soldiers soviets, or councils, much as the Communist Party in the Soviet Union had done. Only the difference was that in Germany, the revolution was successfully put down, this by the German military, because the socialist government of President Friedrich Ebert, E-B-E-R-T, the first president of the Weimar Republic, was very much afraid of the Bolsheviks, as well as the German industrialists and the very sizable German middle class. So they not only saw to it that the German generals of the German imperial days remained in power, but as I mentioned earlier in the broadcast, they set up 3 military organizations, the Freikorps or Free Corps, the Einwohnerwehren, and the Zeitfreiwilligenverbände. These organizations, composed of the supposedly demobilized German army, successfully quelled the German Revolution. Adolf Hitler, by the way, infiltrated the German Revolution in Munich as an undercover agent for the political department of the Reichswehr under General von Lossow, and then fingered the leaders of the revolution. After the German army took over Munich. They were then promptly shot. These organizations, the Freikorps, the Einwohnerwehr, and the Zeitfreiwilligenverbände, after the expiration of their formal terms, they remained intact underground and became known as the so-called Black Reichswehr, or Underground Reichswehr, Underground German Army. They then proceeded to systematically assassinate not only the leaders of the abortive Bolshevik revolution in Germany, such the various people, Karl von Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg. They also proceeded to assassinate the legitimate democratic leadership of Weimar Germany, ranging from socialist to social democratic. People like Foreign Minister Walter von Rathenau, Kurt Eisner, Karl Gereis, Matthias Erzberger, Gustav Landauer. Names history hasn't remembered. They were dispatched by the so-called Black Reichswehr, and that paved the way for Hitler's rise to power, because much of the legitimate political leadership that could have opposed him was dead and buried by 1933, when von Hindenburg appointed him chancellor. It should be noted, though, that as a result of the experience of the German army at the end of World War I, when the socialist president Friedrich Ebert deliberately called on the German generals and enlisted their help to put down the German Revolution, the German General Staff and their industrialists and the Nazi Party, which had its genesis in this period, understood that the threat of communism could be used as a tremendously effective strategic tool in order to effect not only their own survival and perpetuation, but as I will touch on later, the Nazis were able to utilize fear of communism on the part of many industrialists around the world, not only to enlist support, but also to effect the conquest of some of the armies they opposed. The French army, for example, was formally surrendered by Maréchal Pétain, the head of the Vichy collaborationist government, in order to, quote, fight communism. There was a very powerful socialist movement in France prior to World War II, chiefly grouped around the social front of Léon Blum, B-L-U-M. Many of the French industrialists and financiers and many of the French officer corps and general staff were more afraid of the socialists in their own country than foreign fascists. There were powerful fascist movements in France, notably the Croix de Fer, or Iron Cross, and the Cagoule, C-A-G-O-U-L-E, a group of French fascists, or a French fascist organization similar in some ways to the Ku Klux Klan. They would conduct assassinations and depredations with hoods over their faces. They were called the, quote, hooded ones, or les Cagoulards, C-A-G-O-U-L-A-R-D-S. The Croix de Fer and La Cagoule actually conducted an abortive fascist coup in 1938. It was put down, similar in some ways to the abortive fascist coup in the United States in 1934 that I discussed in Radio Free America program number 10. But again, the important thing to understand here is that as a result of their experience in the German Revolution at the end of World War I, the German General Staff, the industrialists and financiers who backed them, and the Nazi Party, which had its genesis in this period, came to understand that the fear of communism could be exploited in a most effective way as a tool of conquest. Of the experience of the German General Staff and the German Army, and during the German Revolution, the abortive German Revolution of 1918 and afterward, Kurt Rees writes as follows. On November 9th, 1918, the day of the German Revolution, the gentlemen in the general headquarters on the front were in a highly nervous state. They waited. There was a direct telephone line connecting the General Staff with the Chancellery in Berlin. They waited. They wondered. Would the man who was now the head of the provisory government of the Republic, the former socialist deputy Friedrich Ebert, E-B-E-R-T, answer the telephone if they called him? In short, would he collaborate with the General Staff? Or would he dismiss the men who represented everything the socialists had been fighting against, and who, on top of it all, had lost the war? The chief of the General Staff, Wilhelm Groener, G-R-O-E-N-E-R, tried the line, and President Ebert answered. Friedrich Ebert was willing to collaborate with the generals. The socialists wanted the officers to continue in service to protect law and order in Germany. Against whom? Naturally, against the people who had actually believed that a real revolution was on, and that that those who had been directly or indirectly responsible for the war were to be driven from power. After the first conversation, Ebert called back very soon. The man who answered his call was Major Kurt von Schleicher, Schleicher. How relieved he must have felt when the bell rang. How relieved General von Hindenburg and his comrades must have felt as well. So there wasn't going to be any revolution. The Social Democrats really didn't want to change so much after all, did they? Major Kurt von Schleicher did not lose much time with such considerations. On the same day, on November 9, 1918, which has become the historic date of the German Revolution, he began to lay his plans to fight the republic which he supposedly protected. On this very day, he began to lay his plans to counteract the conditions of the armistice and whatever conditions the peace treaty might impose upon Germany. On this very date, he started the underground movement of the Imperial German Army. It was all very secret. It had to be, because it was a conspiracy not only against the former enemies, but a conspiracy against the very republic which the officers had sworn to defend, and which incidentally paid the salaries of those officers. A conspiracy in which the Army Ministry of the Republic collaborated gleefully for many years to come. A few disturbing facts leaked out here and there. A few courageous journalists wrote of what was going on behind the scenes. A few convinced Republicans were murdered, that's with a small r, by the way. A few convinced Republicans were murdered, while others were accused of high treason and put into prison. The government, in spite of the fact that it knew better, declared again and again that there was not one iota of truth in the current rumors about the existence of a number of secret armies, a so-called Schwarze Reichswehr, or Black Army, in Germany. Such talk, they said, was all propaganda paid for by France and possibly by Poland. But in spite of these pretenses and excuses, there were such secret armies. As for the official army, the one permitted by the Treaty of Versailles, it never had quite come down to the number of men it was supposed to contain. Schleicher had seen to that, and he had also seen to it that this small army of the new republic was extremely un-republican. He had taken care that this army should contain not only nationalist and supranationalist elements, he had taken care that this army should contain only nationalist and supranationalist elements who were waiting impatiently for the day when they could turn against the republic, against its democratic representatives, and of course later against the whole world to take revenge for the war lost in 1918. Little troops and units began to spring up here and there which had no connection with the regular army, although the arms they possessed could only have been obtained from the army proper. These troops, so Schleicher explained, should not be disarmed because they protected the country against the communist danger, which he asserted, though without presenting the slightest evidence in proof of his assertion, was growing steadily from day to day. One more time, these next two sentences are a key. These troops, so Schleicher explained, should not be disarmed because they protected the enemy against the communist danger, which, he asserted, though without presenting the slightest evidence in proof of his assertions, was growing steadily from day to day. This, by the way, is something we're going to come back to, this principle of the growing communist danger. We're going to see this in the Cold War period as something that the Pentagon has come to call threat inflation. Continuing, but it was not the communist danger. It was those troops which grew from day to day. During the year 1922, many of them sprang up near the eastern frontier. Their main task was to gather the war material which, according to the Treaty of Versailles, should have been destroyed or surrendered to get it in good shape and to hide it. Some of these groups had fancy names. Most of them were later to be known as the Free Corps. All of them formed what was to become famous as Schwarze Reichswehr. Thus, the following picture presented itself, visible to the world at large there. Thus, the following picture presented itself. Visible to the world at large, there was this relatively small German Reichswehr. Invisible, that is, underground, there was the Schwarze Reichswehr. Both these armies were led and controlled by the same officers. The ultimate control of both was exercised by the Army Ministry of the German Republic. In fact, the illegal Schwarze Reichswehr was just as thoroughly organized as the regular army. In 1922, so-called Erfassungsabteilungen, collecting departments, were created within the Black Reichswehr. That, by the way, is ERFASSUNGSTABTEILUNGEN. Erfassungsabteilung. Okay, continuing again. The officers of each military district were thus able to assemble personnel files on all men of military age, precisely what had been forbidden by the Versailles Treaty. And from these files, they were able to build up a certain reserve of the regular Reichswehr, a thing which was also forbidden by the treaty. Within the Department of Operations of Military District 1A was a new department called 1AP was created under the somewhat innocent title of Truppenverstärkung, or troop reinforcement. The real task of this department was to run the Black Reichswehr and to form the liaison between it and the regular Reichswehr. By the way, Truppenverstärkung is Truppenverstärkung. The leading men in this Truppenverstärkung were von Bock and von Rundstedt, who were later to become the leading generals in World War II. So again, what we are seeing here at the end of World War I is the German army, and beyond that, their industrialists and financiers, as well as the Nazi Party proper, which grew out of the post-World War II underground German military, the Schwarze Reichswehr. They learned that communism, or the threat of communism, could itself be used as a major strategic tool, not only for survival and perpetuation of their own interests, but for conquest as well. By the way, I also, this is an entirely speculative note, and I'm simply going to toss this in as something of an aside. One of the things that has really fascinated me about observing the realities of German history, and again, this none of this program should be interpreted as being anti-German. I have tremendous respect for the individual Germans that I've met, and indeed my program, for at least for quite a while, and for all I know still, was being played on a major Berlin radio station. By the way, I also, this is an entirely speculative note, and I'm simply going to toss this in as something of an aside. One of the things that has really fascinated me about observing the realities of German history, and again, this none of this program should be interpreted as being anti-German. I have tremendous respect for the individual Germans that I've met, and indeed my program, for at least for quite a while, and for all I know still, was being played on a major Berlin radio station. But one of the interesting things, my background, by the way, my academic background is in psychology, and one of the things that exerts a profound influence on the cognitive and psychological processes of any given society is their language. The psycholinguistics of a society are a dominant element in helping to shape the thinking and cognitive process of any society. I've always wondered about not wondered, I should say, but ruminated about the German language and its relationship to the German mind. The broad vision of German political and military thinkers is a matter of public record. I've touched on that record earlier in the program. German intellectual culture itself is extremely intense, and I've often wondered about the German language itself and its role in helping to shape the cognitive and intellectual processes of German society. This term here, collecting departments, is one word in German. You know, the Erfassungsabteilungen, I can usually pronounce these pretty well. Erfassungsabteilungen, or collecting departments. That's one word, and I sometimes wonder, this may be complete BS, but I wonder about the German language and its ability to subsume several words into one single word, and I wonder about the relationship between that and the German intellect and political intellect in particular, which has been possessed for a long time of a much broader and more intense vision than the political intellect and the intellect and cognitive processes of an awful lot of other peoples. Again, maybe complete BS, make of it what you will, but their language is quite remarkable, and I often wonder about that as one with a background in academic background in psychology and psycholinguistics in particular. In any event, what we're going to look at now is the Allies, that is the Allies at the end of World War I, and their collaboration with the German General Staff, with the industrialists and financiers in post-World War I Germany, and their role in seeing to it that the same elements which dominated Imperial Germany, the same elements which were ascendant under the Kaiser, would dominate Germany after the Kaiser resigned, and which would dominate not only the Weimar Republic, but which would bring about the Nazi Party proper and the resurgence of German military and imperial power at the end at the end of World War I and leading up to World War II. And again, the German Revolution taught the experience of the German General Staff and their political allies. That experience taught them that the fear of communism, the fear of Bolshevism, could be used very effectively as a tool of political and military perpetuation and as a tool of military and political conquest. They made good use of it in World War II. Again, one of the reasons that many of the armies of Western Europe fell so quickly was that not only many of their officers, but also many of the industrialists and financiers and political leaders behind them were really more afraid of socialists in their own country than fascists from another country, and many of them welcomed the Germans in and collaborated with them. The Germans, to a certain extent, the Third Reich soldiers for these particular elements, sort of comprised a sort of coal and iron police, labor enforcers, basically, and they were quite happy to have them around. This was well understood by the Nazi Party and by the German General Staff and its espionage components, and they utilized these fifth column movements in other countries to a tremendous extent. And again, what we're going to look at now is how the Allies at the end of World War I collaborated in order to see to it that the same reactionary political and military elements were reconstituted in post-World War I Germany in order to prevent, quote, Bolshevism, unquote, or communism. Continuing now with The Nazis Go Underground by Kurt Rees. The revolution had brought to life so-called soldiers, Soviets. The Allied command in the Rhineland suspended both them and the workers' Soviets during the very first days of the occupation and declined to have any dealings with representatives of leftist parties or to discuss with them any problem such as that of feeding the population, though these leftists happened to be of the same parties that ran the Berlin government. On the contrary, the Allies demanded that only men should be sent to them who had held their jobs before the revolution. The last sentence again, because it's a key one. On the contrary, the Allies demanded that only men should be sent to them who had held their jobs before the revolution. That this strange state of affairs actually existed is proved by many documents. There is, for instance, the report of Colonel I.L. Hunt, H-U-N-T, in charge of all civil affairs of the 3rd American Army in the Rhineland. Hunt wrote, quote, "Many of the ex-imperial officers throughout Germany remained at their posts. In occupied territory, their retention of office was made a condition of the armistice. The political institutions with which the American Army came into contact during the occupation were without exception those of the old regime." According to Colonel Hunt, it all worked out fine. The requirement of the armistice that the civil government in the occupied zone should continue to be conducted by the old German officials assured a continuance in office of experienced and competent men. No case of an official declining to continue his duties was brought to the attention of the 3rd Army headquarters. The autocratic nature of the Prussian civil service peculiarly fits in to adapt itself to the wishes of an occupying military force. And again, Hunt adds, in the first days of the occupation, the ideas of the great middle class were being revolutionized under the pressure of internal disorder and the opinion of the outside world. This was unfortunate, since it was to this body of public opinion that Germany would have to turn if she were to erect a stable, democratic government. Hence, in many cases, our arrival was welcomed by the ex-imperial officials who regarded our coming as being of great assistance in enforcing their authority, which had been weakened by the revolution. The last sentence again. Hence, in many cases, our arrival was welcomed by the ex-imperial officials who regarded our coming as being of great assistance in enforcing their authority, which had been weakened by the revolution. Paragraph 5 of the armistice, stipulation that occupied territories should continue to be administered by their local authorities, was so interpreted by both Germany and the Allies that, quote, local authorities, unquote, meant officials of the old regime, period. As a result, the armies of occupation had a thoroughly capable group of officials to carry out their orders and wishes. So again, the fear of Bolshevism or communism basically led the Allied occupation of Germany at the end of World War I to see to it that the old imperial governmental and political officials, as well as the German general staff, were kept in place, and this permitted the reconstitution of imperial German political power and military power, and ultimately led to the rise of the Nazi Party. Just as not only more reactionary politicians, but also, as we've seen, the socialist president of Weimar Germany, Friedrich Ebert, also turned to these same interests in order to protect against the German Revolution. Again, this had a profound effect on the strategic and political thinking of not only the German general staff, but again, the industrialists and financiers behind them, as well as the Nazi Party. And fear of communism, fear of Bolshevism became, for the Third Reich, both prior to and during World War II and the residual elements which survived World War II, it became a major strategic consideration, and one which has had an enormous effect on the post-World War II world, one which ultimately, as we will see in weeks to come, led directly to the formation in the United States of the fascist milieu involving the petroleum industry, the intelligence community, the residual Third Reich elements, the American far right, the defense industry, and the American mainstream political superstructure. That milieu, we've looked at the development of it, we've looked at, or the nature of that milieu we've looked at in the past 2 weeks, in particular its operation vis-a-vis the Kennedy assassination. Bear in mind that George Bush was part and is part and parcel to that milieu. What we're going to look at now is the implications of the occupation of Germany for the perpetuation of the Third Reich by underground means. Returning once again to The Nazis Go Underground by Kurt Reese. Reese writes, espionage is espionage is not an art practiced for art's sake. It is the gathering of information in preparation for war. The coming Nazi underground will have to organize a worldwide net of espionage, or rather a whole series of espionage systems, because the Nazi underground means war. In the last analysis, the coming Nazi underground is war in itself, or, to change a phrase of von Clausewitz, the continuation of war with different means. The coming Nazi underground is war itself. If we want to get a clear picture of how this war will be waged, it is necessary to differentiate between short-range tactics and long-range strategy. The strategy of the comeback, which may be put into effect 10 or 15 years hence, depends largely on what the world will be like 10 or 15 years hence. As for the short-range tactics, they too will depend on what happens. But since the choice of what may take place inside Germany during the last stage of the war and immediately afterward is limited, the choice of tactics the underground can employ is limited too. The worst thing which could possibly happen to the Nazi underground is a decisive Russian victory, with the Russians alone occupying part or perhaps the whole of Germany. The Bolsheviks know from their own experience that it does not pay to be forgiving, so they will be ruthless. They will shoot 100 people in order to be sure of liquidating 10 dangerous ones. They will shut down any number of plants, organizations, or offices which might serve as hideouts for Nazis. They may shut down hospitals if need be. They don't mind confusion and disorder. If they think that they will deal Nazism a death blow by closing power stations, large German cities will go without light. In brief, if the Russians take over in Germany, many of the ruses planned by the Nazi underground will have been in vain. The same thing will happen if the armies of the now occupied countries should go into Germany. The Czechs, the Poles, the Norwegians, the French won't be easily deceived. They know plenty about underground methods. Neither the Americans nor the British will be so dangerous to the Nazis as the Russians and the now enslaved peoples. We know little of the technique of underground work. We will try to be fair. We will see to it that the war criminals get a chance to defend themselves. We will be considerate, and we'll lose time thereby. Well, in retrospect, we were more than considerate. We'll go into that as we examine in weeks to come not only the Gehlen organization itself, but also the reinstitution in the Federal Republic of Germany, not just of the Gehlen organization, but also of interests. And we looked at that in a big way in Radio Free America #2, as well as in an archive show that I did this past spring called The Old Germany and the New Nazis, in which I replayed a section of Radio Free America #2, and also read into the record a white paper by Martin Lee dealing with the apparent resurgence of Nazism in contemporary united Germany. What we're going to take a look at now is a speculative element of World War II history, something that was going on at the tail end of World War II. Bear in mind, the Kurt Riess book was authored in 1944. In fact, specifically, I believe, March of 1944. What we're going to look at now concerns one of the most enigmatic episodes of the Second World War, namely the capture by Eisenhower's armies of the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen over the Rhine. It was the capture of this bridge which permitted the armies of the Western Allies to flood into Germany and to occupy most of it. If you look at a map during the Cold War period of divided Germany, West Germany was much, much larger than East Germany. And it was the capture of the bridge at Remagen which permitted this. The Rhine was being seen by Hitler as a major defense line, and the Allies had drawn up, the Western Allies had drawn up to the Rhine. The capture of the Ludendorff Bridge permitted those armies to pour over the Rhine in this major defense line in a big way, and was a major element in the occupation of most of Germany by the Western Allies, and indeed, as Kurt Riess had foreseen in 1944, that proved to be much more conducive to the reconstitution of political reaction in Germany than an occupation of all of Germany or most of it by the Soviets would have been. We're going to take a look now at a book called The Last Hero, subtitled Wild Bill Donovan. That's by Anthony Cave Brown, cave as in caveman. This book was published in hardcover by New York Times Books and copyrighted 1982. What we're going to take a look at now is the approach, the diplomatic approaches that were made by the German General Staff to the Western Allies, specifically to the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, World War II's intelligence service and precursor of the CIA, that headed up by Wild Bill Donovan, William, quote, Wild Bill, unquote, Donovan. He was the head of it. And specifically, these approaches were conducted under the auspices of the Vatican, and Baron Ernst von Weizsäcker, who was an associate of Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, head of the German Abwehr, German military intelligence during World War II. By the way, Weizsäcker's son, Richard Weizsäcker, is the current president of Germany. Not the chancellor, that's Helmut Kohl, but the president. And as we will see here, the Germans were indeed seeking to work out an agreement with the Western Allies, which would permit them, basically they were seeking to open the Western Front and to permit the Allies to occupy most of Germany. Officially, that never happened, but as Anthony Cave Brown points out, the circumstances surrounding William Donovan's movements, Wild Bill Donovan's movements in this time period, which were highly mysterious, and the strange circumstances surrounding the capture of the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, suggest at least the possibility that, in fact, sub rosa, such a deal may have taken place. This is a speculative note. Cave Brown underscores that, so do I. I suspect, though, that there may be far more to this than what the general public has been led to believe by the conventional history. Reading now from The Last Hero, Wild Bill Donovan, by Anthony Cave Brown, a chapter called FDR's Death and the German Surrender. In March of 1945, Donovan's movements, which were always difficult to track, became exceedingly mysterious at a time when the German General Staff was indicating its desire to open the Western Front to the Western Allies and allow them to occupy all Germany before the Red Army. At least in part, these approaches derived from WJD's, that's William Donovan's, special connections at the Vatican. These had opened up in July and August of 1944, when Donovan held highly secret conversations with the German ambassador at the Holy See, Baron Ernst von Weizsäcker, an associate of Canaris's. That's W-E-I-Z-S-A-C-K-E-R. Continuing. The conversations were arranged by, it is believed, Pope Pius XII, for WJD saw the Pope in July. And following the talks, the contact between Donovan and Weizsäcker was maintained, as the Donovan papers show, by Colonel Joseph Rodrigo, R-O-D-R-I-G-O, a regular Army intelligence officer who had transferred to the OSS and was stationed in Italy. Rodrigo's contact with Weizsäcker was through Weizsäcker's counselor at the embassy, Albert von Kessel, K-E-S-S-E-L. It was to transpire that both Weizsäcker and Kessel had connections with important members of the German General Staff, including the Chief of the German General Staff, General Heinz Guderian, and Field Marshal von Rundstedt, the Supreme German Commander on the Western Front. Guderian is Guderian. While the matter broached by Weizsäcker and Kessel was an attempt to surrender on terms intended to permit the Wehrmacht to maintain the Eastern Front, terms that were, therefore, totally unacceptable, in Weizsäcker there nevertheless remained a powerful and influential contact with the German General Staff, a replacement for the unfortunate Canaris, who had been arrested after the July 20th bomb attack on Hitler's life and was, it was thought, in an SS concentration camp. The Weizsäcker contact was still in existence in March of 1945 when the Allied armies rolled up to the Rhine for the last offensive against Germany. As a result, the secret war had entered its trickiest stage, one in which the OSS was required to display the most judicial attitudes towards the reports from its representatives overseas if the Grand Alliance was not to be damaged and perhaps destroyed at the most critical phase of the war when the nature of the peace was being decided. After several real and false attempts at securing an accommodation with the Western powers, on January 24, 1945, as the German panzer armies were withdrawing from the Ardennes, Donovan advised the Joint Chiefs of Staff that the German ambassador to the Vatican, Baron von Weizsäcker, and Kessel had informed a British representative that they were prepared to give important information concerning General de Panzergruppen Heinz Guderian, that Guderian, with Rundstedt, was prepared to open the Western Front to Eisenhower's armies. A couple of points here. Once again, I want to underscore that any competent history of World War II or the Third Reich will reveal, it's not hardly a secret, that during the closing phases of the war, Adolf Hitler sought to persuade Britain and the United States to forego their alliance with the Soviet Union and to ally with Germany instead and to conduct an offensive against the Red Army. This would be a reconstituted alliance in which Germany, the residua of the Third Reich, would ally with Britain and the United States and go against the Soviet Union. General Patton, among others, was ardently in favor of doing exactly that. I would also note, too, that Pope Pius XII, the former Cardinal Eugenio Pacelli, was an individual whose sympathies to fascism are well recorded. It was then Cardinal Eugenio Pacelli, who was the papal nuncio to Munich, who, according to a fellow named John Murphy in his book La Popessa that we covered in Radio Free America number 17, actually began channeling Vatican funds to Adolf Hitler as early as 1919 to help combat, again, the German Revolution, because the atheistic aspect of Marxism was deeply repugnant to the Catholic Church, and so they too were willing to collaborate with reactionary elements, and according to John Murphy in La Popessa, then Cardinal Eugenio Pacelli, the papal nuncio to Munich, was actually funding Hitler with Vatican money as early as 1919. Later, the Pacelli family was deeply involved in concluding the Lateran Treaty with Mussolini in Italy, which made Roman Catholicism the official state religion of fascist Italy. And then when Pacelli became Pope Pius XII, he canceled, basically, a plan by Pius XI to repudiate fascism and instituted a number of accommodations with the Third Reich. We went into that, as well as this particular section from The Last Hero, in the aforementioned Radio Free America number 17, Fascism and the Vatican. Now, skipping down, bear in mind here that under Vatican auspices, the German General Staff are making overtures to the Western Allies, a proposition to open up the Western Front and to permit the Allies to occupy all or most of Germany. Skipping down, Anthony K. Brown writes, "Now events took a most mysterious turn, which seems to have involved Donovan directly. Donovan left the Western Front for Washington on February 7, 1945, arrived back in the United States on the 8th, and lunched with Ruth, his wife, according to her diary, on the 9th. He then rejoined his headquarters, busying himself with many matters, the most important being his plans for a post-war Central Intelligence Service, the plans that had been so rudely exposed by Trohan in mid-February. That was a Chicago Tribune journalist spelled Trohan. Continuing, yet despite the highest importance of the CIA matter, in the third week of February 1945, something made Donovan leave Washington suddenly, and very secretly, he went to unusual lengths to cover his tracks. Where he went, whom he saw remain a mystery. His OSS records show he was in Washington throughout this period, but his personnel file with the Adjutant General shows that on February 24, 1945, he departed for the European Theater of Operations, while on February 26, 1945, Ruth recorded, quote, "Bill did leave today for Hawaii." Continuing. It seems that Donovan's journey was connected with a signal sent on February 27th by Eisenhower to Marshall and the combined chiefs that he had, quote, "received word via OSS channels of a possible approach by one or more senior German officers with the proposal of facilitating an Allied victory in the West in order to end the war promptly," unquote. Eisenhower advised that he had, quote, "replied to my informant that as these reports have gone to my governments, any action on political levels will obviously be taken at their direction, and that so far as purely military approach is concerned, the channels should be those which are reorganized or recognized by the customs and usages of war," unquote. He ended his message by stating that he had, quote, "no intention of choking off this channel of possible communication with me," unquote. As part of that intention, Donovan's representative at Eisenhower's headquarters, Lieutenant Colonel Franklin O. Canfield, Canfield, received a request from one of Eisenhower's staff officers to be ready to take part in staff conversations with representatives of the German General Staff intended to realize a surrender of all German forces on the Western Front. Canfield was to recall that he was not told where the conversations were to be held or with whom they were to be held. He held himself in readiness for several days and then, quote, "So far as I was concerned, the lines went dead, and I heard no more about the conversations," unquote. The question, therefore, was whether Donovan flew to Europe to take over this contact. Nobody could be sure because nobody could be sure because of the mystery that always attended Donovan's journeys. As Robert Joyce, Joyce, was to state, quote, "Donovan was always flying in unannounced without saying where he had come from. Our long association seems to have been confined to meetings between the two of us between 1 a.m. and 4 a.m. on some highly secret political matter. And then he would vanish in his DC-3, unquote. This was by no means the end of the mystery. While it is known that the Rundstedt talks came to naught, Eisenhower was prepared to accept nothing less than unconditional surrender to all members of the Grand Alliance, including Russia. On March 7th, there occurred one of the most dramatic and inexplicable incidents of the campaign in northwestern Europe. This was the failure of the German General Staff to destroy the Ludendorff Bridge over the Rhine at Remagen, the bridge over which the U.S. First Army flowed to take over vast areas of central Germany before they were occupied by the Red Army. In the period after the Battle of the Bulge, the Western Front was marked by bitter and bloody fighting as General Eisenhower's armies closed up to the Rhine from the North Sea to the Swiss frontier. On the Rhine, it seemed probable, even certain, that Hitler had made that mighty river his main line of defense for the Ruhr, the industrial heartland of Germany, and the entire Reich. To cross that river, therefore, would require the employment of all arms on the scale of Cobra to break out operations in Normandy in August of 1944, when 4 Allied armies were required to crack the German line. A massive, expensive, possibly bloody and unsuccessful campaign that seemed unjustified at this late stage in the war, if a bridge could be obtained by coup de main or clandestine means. Several attempts to get a bridge using such means were undertaken. At a time when there was great apprehension that the Red Army might occupy all of Germany unless the Allies did so before them, in mid-February, Eisenhower began to press upon his commanders what an official U.S. Army historian would call his, quote, intense interest, unquote, in seizing a bridge over the Rhine. Donovan, who had been at Eisenhower's headquarters in early February just before returning to Washington, could not have been unaware of this intense interest, for in the period in which the Allied armies closed up to the Rhine, there were a number of schemes, some of them involving special means to seize a bridge. But all failed until Remagen. Then, when the U.S. First Army moved up to the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, its scouts found the bridge still standing. The German engineers on the bridge had set sufficient explosives to bring the bridge down, but when they tried to activate the explosives, they found that, strangely, the wires leading to the detonators had been cut by, so it was said at the time, shrapnel from exploding shells. Continuing. Yet men with suspicious minds in the Allied clandestine services believed there was more to the mystery of the Remagen Bridge than that, although it was true they had little evidence to support their beliefs. To them it seemed inconceivable that the Germans, ordinarily so efficient at demolition, had not demolished the Ludendorff Bridge, the last entry into the inner bastion of the Reich. Certainly Hitler believed there had been treachery. He relieved Rundstedt of command, and flying courts-martial shot everyone involved whom they could get their hands on. And Stalin, too, believed that there had been some arrangement between the Western powers and the Wehrmacht. In the course of an acrid correspondence between FDR, Stalin, and Churchill, dealing with allegations that the Western powers were secretly negotiating a German surrender that would permit the Wehrmacht to continue operations against the Red Army, Stalin wrote to FDR on April 5, 1945, "You affirm that so far no negotiations have been entered into. Apparently, you are not fully informed. As regards my military colleagues, they, on the basis of information in their possession, are sure that the negotiations did take place and that they ended in an agreement with the Germans whereby the German commander on the Western Front is to open the front to the Anglo-American troops and let them move east, while the British and Americans had promised in exchange to ease the armistice terms for the Germans." Stalin then made a statement that was not correct but was fairly close to the truth. Quote, "And so what we have at the moment is that the Germans on the Western Front have in fact ceased the war against Britain and America. At the same time they continue the war against Russia, the ally of Britain and the USA." Unquote. He concluded threateningly, again quoting, "I think I must repeat that I and my colleagues would never in any circumstances have taken such a hazardous step, for we realize that a momentary advantage, no matter how great, is overshadowed by the fundamental advantage of preserving and promoting trust between allies." Unquote. Then, when Roosevelt and Churchill rejected Stalin's accusations, Stalin asserted, again quoting, "It is hard to agree that the absence of German resistance on the Western Front is due solely to the fact that they have been beaten. The Germans have 147 divisions on the Eastern Front. They could safely withdraw from 15 to 20 divisions from the Eastern Front to aid their forces on the Western Front. Yet they have not done so, nor are they doing so. They are fighting desperately against the Russians for Zemlenice, Zemlenice, an obscure station in Czechoslovakia, which they need just as much as a dead man needs a poultice, but they surrender without any resistance such important towns in the heart of Germany as Osnabrück, Mannheim, and Kassel. You will admit that this behavior on the part of the Germans is more than strange and unaccountable." Unquote. And then K. Brown continues, "Whatever the truth of these assertions, Donovan's movements between February 27th and March 5th, 1945, or what is known about them, are troubling. We have seen that there was secret contact between the OSS and Weizsäcker, and that there was contact at the same time between Allen Dulles and representatives of the German High Command in Italy, the object of which was to realize the surrender of the German armies in Italy. Moreover, since the matter of the Remagen Bridge has never been adequately investigated, at least by anyone with any knowledge of clandestine operations, it is at least reasonable for the historian to cast a cold eye on the generally accepted explanation for this remarkable event." Skipping down, "The mystery attending Donovan's movements between February 27th and March 5th, 1945, certainly suggests his involvement in very secret activities, and at that time there was no OSS activity more secret and important than the various contacts with the German High Command, which, as we shall soon see, led to the surrender of all German armies in Italy. Indeed, given WJD's personality, it would have been remarkable had he not been directly involved in such a historic matter." So again, we will probably never know for sure just exactly what happened with the Remagen Bridge, but it may be, and this is obviously what I call food for thought and grounds for further research, it may be that in fact such a sub rosa agreement between the German General Staff and the Western Allies was reached, and that the accidental failure of the Germans to blow the Remagen Bridge was something less than totally accidental. We'll never know for sure, but again, with the tremendous importance that the Remagen Bridge, the Ludendorff Bridge, had in allowing the Western armies to pour into Germany and occupy it before the Red Army, given the fact that, as Cave Brown as he has noted, the movements of William Wild Bill Donovan at the time were extremely secretive, given the fact that the German General Staff was approaching the Western Allies, and given the fact that the importance of having non-communists, the relatively sympathetic Western Allies in possession of Germany, would be vital to permitting a German comeback. It's a possibility that has to be very seriously considered. I would note, too, that although a lot of this might seem to be arcane and long ago and not important to some listeners, I can sympathize. As William Faulkner has said, the past is never dead and buried. It isn't even past. And for people who think that perhaps this history that we're going into has no relevance, I'd like to go back once again to The Last Hero, Wild Bill Donovan by Anthony Cave Brown, and I'm going to read a section of the author's note, and this is how this particular British historian came to write the first comprehensive history of William Donovan and the OSS. There have been other books about the OSS, but none of them from the official files. In the author's note we find, in what was his last act of World War II, Major General William J. Donovan, Director of the Office of Strategic Services, the first American Secret Intelligence and Special Operations Service, and the organization from which sprang the CIA, spent several nights at OSS headquarters in Washington, D.C. with his executive officer, Lieutenant Edwin J. Putzel, P-U-T-Z-E-L-L, Jr., microfilming the director's files. Doing the work themselves because of the political sensitivity of the documentation, they produced 2 copies. Donovan took possession of one, Putzel the other. The purpose of this large operation was to provide the basis of a history of Donovan's incumbency when that became politically possible. Now we're going to take a look at what happened to people who started to write the history of the OSS beginning in the 50s, a decade after the war. Several starts were made on work. Professor Conyers Reed, R-E-A-D, the Harvard historian, produced many draft chapters before Donovan himself asked him to stop work because he felt the director's papers were still too sensitive. Reed did not resume his work, for death intervened. One of Donovan's wartime majors, Corey Ford, F-O-R-D, then began work on the project in the mid-1950s, producing a draft manuscript of what was really a biographical history of Donovan and the OSS, but again, death intervened before Ford could complete his volume. After Donovan's death in 1959, the project was taken over by Whitney Shepardson, S-H-E-P-A-R-D-S-O-N, Donovan's chief of secret intelligence during World War II. For the 3rd time, the author died before completing the work. Then came the 4th attempt, this time by Cornelius Ryan, the author of The Longest Day. However, although Ryan had the support of Donovan's friends, President Dwight D. Eisenhower and Allen W. Dulles, then Director of Central Intelligence, the work was stopped before it really began. A middle-rank official at the CIA managed to stop the project because he believed the book contemplated by Ryan would be too controversial. When he found himself denied access to the director's files, Ryan was compelled to abandon the project temporarily. Then, he too died before it was possible to resume work. And we're going to find out how Cave Brown now, after 4 people attempted to do it, one of them was frustrated by Donovan, another by the CIA, and they all died very conveniently before they could complete the work. We're going to find out how Anthony Cave Brown came to be the one to write the official history of the OSS Ryan and Donovan from Donovan's own microfilm files. Skipping down. Now, by the way, this meeting here between Anthony Cave Brown and William Casey, who became Reagan's director of CIA, a good buddy, by the way, of Prescott Bush Sr., George Bush's father. This particular meeting took place in 1977 after a meeting of the veterans of Strategic Services, OSS veterans, and this was while William Casey was a member of the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board. Cave Brown writes, after the talk, I was invited with other members of the VSS to a party at the El Morocco nightclub, and there I met William J. Casey, who as a younger man had been Donovan's chief of secret intelligence in Europe. Casey was now a member of the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Committee and was soon to become Director of Central Intelligence in the Reagan administration. He suggested that I might like to do the Donovan biography. Immediately I declared that I was not the man for the job because its politics made it work for an American, not a Briton. Casey disagreed, for as he said, quote, "An Englishman is not likely to be either a Democrat or a Republican," unquote. And again, I cite this by way of showing that this history that I'm going into, it might seem long ago and arcane, particularly to some of the younger members of the audience. It is anything but unimportant. In particular, I love the way the first four authors dropped dead before they're able, or potential authors dropped dead. Bear in mind that Professor Conyers Reed of Harvard was dissuaded by William Donovan himself. Cornelius Ryan was interfered with by a middle-level official at the CIA. Certainly, people die, obviously, and it's certainly possible that some of these deaths may have been natural causes or accidental or whatever. But simply from the standpoint of statistical probability, the notion that all four men would die before they finished is quite unlikely. I love the way the author here phrases it. Once again, death intervened, as though death were some sort of deus ex machina being lowered onto the classical stage. I am death, and I shall now intervene. We're now going to go back once again to the book The Nazis Go Underground by Kurt Riess from 1944. And what we're going to look at now is one of the major strategic and theoretical considerations as we examine the history of the formation of the milieu that we looked at in the first two installments of Radio Free America 37, this fascist milieu involving Gehlen, or Third Reich alumni on both sides of the Atlantic, both the Gehlen-linked white Russian people who were entirely responsible for handling the Oswalds in Dallas-Fort Worth, as well as the elements in Germany that were involved with surfacing the story about Lee Harvey Oswald having fired at Edwin Walker, and also the elements involved with generating the myth that Lee Harvey Oswald was a KGB assassin. Because one of the major strategic elements that Kurt Riess felt that the incipient Nazi underground would have to do would be to form operational links with the very large and ongoing fascist parties and fascist elements in some of the Western countries. Now, again, in the first two Radio Free America shows, Radio Free America number 10 as well as Uncle Sam and the Swastika, Uncle Sam and El Duce, and others, I took a look at the American industrialists and financiers who were not only supportive of Hitler from an economic and practical standpoint, but also many of them supported Hitler and Mussolini politically as well, and many of them undertook to establish fascism in the United States. Recall that there was an abortive fascist coup in this country in 1934, and there were very strong, active fascist organizations in some of the Western countries, such as the Mosley Organization in Britain, the National Front, and they had their corresponding elements in the United States as well. And unlike the fascist parties in some areas, the American fascist parties were not substantively dealt with. Most of them had been euphemized in post-World War II history as, quote, nationalist organizations. But one of the most significant reasons to study the assassination of John Kennedy, the most significant reason certainly is to understand the political forces at work. One of the most terrifying aspects of looking at the milieu, which we looked at in our first two installments of this Radio Free America show, is to see an active operational link between the American far right, such as John Birch Society-linked elements like the Hunt family and General Edwin Walker, with German fascists, many of them Third Reich and SS and Gestapo alumni, people like Theodor Oberlander. We took a look at Nelson Bunker Hunt's role as the Texas representative of the International Committee for the Defense of Christian Culture, involving people like Theodor Oberlander, a key SS officer and liaison man between the Gehlen Organization and the Vlasov Army. We took a look at Charles Willoughby, née Karl Adolf Wiedenbach, MacArthur's intelligence officer who became an advisor to Franco after the war, people like Hermann Punder, and obviously with the story being floated in the Deutsche Nationalzeitung and Soldatenzeitung of Gerhard Frey of Lee Harvey Oswald having fired at Edwin Walker and missed, supposedly again Marina Oswald, whose testimony was entirely handled by this Gehlen-linked group of white Russians and anti-Bolshevik Bloc of Nations-linked white Russians. Marina Oswald supposedly disclosed that to the world for the first time on December 3rd, 1963. Supposedly that was the first time the information ever made the light of day. Nobody's ever bothered to explain how Major General Edwin Walker, an active Bircher, fired by President Kennedy for having obliged his troops to study the Blue Book of the John Birch Society. Nobody's ever explained how he was able to relay the information to Gerhard Frey, a German neo-Nazi, with several SS and Gestapo veterans on his editorial staff. And again, there are links between Oberlander and Gerhard Frey, between Gerhard Frey and the Witiko League, a group, a proto-Nazi group which sought to restore the Sudetenland to Germany. That link-up between the American far right and Third Reich alumni, and many of them involved with the WACCFL, the steering group for the World Anti-Communist League, and the involvement of this milieu, the involvement in this milieu of the U.S. intelligence community, as we shall see later, the military defense industry, the petroleum industry. That is a truly terrifying political engine. That is the political engine which came into power on 11/22/63. It is the political engine which is in control of the fate of this country and the world right now, and that is why I'm taking a look at its development this evening. But one of the major elements in the reconstitution of Nazism after the formal military defeat of the Third Reich in World War II, according to Kurt Riess, would be the formation of links, operational links, between residual Third Reich elements and sympathetic, like-minded elements in places like Britain and the United States. We're going to return now to The Nazis Go Underground by Kurt Riess, and talking about the value of the Third Reich residual hooking up with sympathetic elements in, among other places, America. Kurt Riess writes, "If I were a Nazi preparing the coming underground at 11 Königsallee in Berlin, what would I think about the numerous, quote, nationalist, unquote, organizations in the United States? We have met SS General Kaltenbrunner, leader of a nationalist movement in Austria. Kaltenbrunner has loads of files. Certainly he must have canvassed the future possibilities in the United States. We may assume that he has elaborate dossiers on each and every nationalist organization in America for further reference. Even if his intelligence services furnished him with only scanty data about the most important organizations, even if his files contain nothing but what any trained reporter in the United States could find out about them without going to any trouble, surely these dossiers would be far from discouraging to him." We're going to return now to The Nazis Go Underground by Kurt Riess, and talking about the value of the Third Reich residual hooking up with sympathetic elements in, among other places, America. Kurt Riess writes, "If I were a Nazi preparing the coming underground at 11 Königsallee in Berlin, what would I think about the numerous, quote, nationalist, unquote, organizations in the United States? We have met SS General Kaltenbrunner, leader of a nationalist movement in Austria. Kaltenbrunner has loads of files. Certainly he must have canvassed the future possibilities in the United States. We may assume that he has elaborate dossiers on each and every nationalist organization in America for further reference. Even if his intelligence services furnished him with only scanty data about the most important organizations, even if his files contain nothing but what any trained reporter in the United States could find out about them without going to any trouble, surely these dossiers would be far from discouraging to him. This is how these dossiers may look." And he begins with the first of these, quote, nationalist, unquote, organizations, the Citizens USA Committee, headed by William G. Grace, G-R-A-C-E. Grace was active before Pearl Harbor. The committee is a direct successor to the Citizens Keep America Out of the War Committee disbanded after Pearl Harbor. Meetings with an attendance of up to 2,000 every Friday night in Chicago. Secretary is Earl Southard, S-O-U-T-H-A-R-D, also organizer for Gerald L.K. Smith's America First Party. By the way, Gerald L.K. Smith, a prominent American fascist funded by, among others, Henry Ford and German intelligence agents operating out of the U.S. Embassy in Washington, D.C., his post-World War II organizations gave direct rise to the current Aryan nations, specifically Wesley Swift, a Gerald L.K. Smith protege, gave rise ultimately to people like William Potter Gale and Richard Gurnt Butler, two of the people we looked at in our Aryan Nation series. Gerald L.K. Smith's personal secretary, by the way, the Reverend Jonathan Perkins, was a good friend and a collaborator with a fellow named the Reverend Jerry Owen, one of Saran's handlers in the Robert Kennedy assassination. When Owen went to be interviewed by Special Unit Senator, the LAPD body in charge with investigating, covering up the assassination of Robert Kennedy, that organization was headed up by two LAPD Mexican-American veterans, both of whom had worked for the CIA in Latin America. Those fellows were Manuel Manny Pena and Enrique Hank Hernandez. Well, when Jerry Owen went to be interviewed by SUS, he was accompanied by the Reverend Jonathan Perkins, Gerald L.K. Smith's personal secretary for 20 years. Beginning again of the Citizens USA Committee headed by William Grace. Secretary is Earl Southard, also organizer for Gerald L.K. Smith's America First Party. Among the speakers are many German Americans. Subjects of meetings: America is going to let German children starve after this war as after the last. The people who sheltered and hid the U-boat saboteurs are not traitors. Italy, Germany, and Hungary are the victims of too much democracy. Internationalism is a blood relative of treason. Isolationism never is treason. Lindbergh would be preferable to Roosevelt as the commander-in-chief. The FBI is as bad as the Gestapo, if not worse. Committee puts out miscellaneous leaflets declaring this war to be a fight between nationalism and internationalism. Well, we're going to jump ahead many, many years. We're going to take a look at a book called The Kennedy Conspiracy. That is subtitled An Uncommissioned Report on the Jim Garrison Investigation. This is authored by Paris Flammonde, Flammonde, copyrighted in 1969, hardcover edition by the Meredith Press. And we're going to take a look at George de Mohrenschildt, the associate of George Bush, possibly George Bush's intelligence handler if Anthony L. Kimry's ruminations are accurate. Certainly an associate of George Bush, one of Lee Harvey Oswald's handlers in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, an individual who worked for Third Reich intelligence after the war, then went to work, during the war, went to work for the CIA after the war, and an individual who helped to corroborate Marina's story that Lee Harvey Oswald shot at Edwin Walker. And of George de Mohrenschildt and some of his associates, Paris Flammonde writes as follows in The Kennedy Conspiracy. In 1939, de Mohrenschildt made his initial entry into the Texas oil business, unquote, continues the Dutch journal. That's a Haagse Post, P-H-A-A-G-S-E-P-O-S-T. Again quoting, he became well known to many of the more important people as a passable polo player among less fanciful things, and with a friend gathered films concerning the conflict between Poland and Hitler's Germany. One of his closer associates was the tycoon William Grace. So George de Mohrenschildt tied in with William Grace. Now again, I'm illustrating here that birds of a feather flock together. What we're looking at here really is networking, and this by way of illustrating that even before the Second World War, some of the German fascists that we saw, or the Third Reich linked operatives like George de Mohrenschildt that we looked at in our first two installments, were in fact networking with some of the very American fascist elements that, according to Kurt Reese, going all the way back to 1944, Third Reich intelligence people would have to hook up with to help effect a reconstituted Third Reich. And again, I would reiterate something that I've spoken about in the past. Forget the word conspiracy. It's a buzzword. As soon as people hear the word conspiracy, they go, I don't believe in conspiracy theories. The word is networking. Indeed, at this point, I think, in calendar year 1992, conspiracy theory is to be seen as what it is. It's a term of not only derogation, but it's a term of political reaction, and it's a term cited by many, both reactionary and so-called progressive forces. Note the use of the term so-called to continue to cover up some very important historical realities. But networking is really the operant term here. People network all the time, and beyond that, an espionage organization is often referred to as a spy network. But again, this is simply by way of showing the birds of the same feather that were flocking together as early as 1939, and George de Mohrenschildt, the turkey who helped handle Lee Harvey Oswald, is one of the people that we looked at in our first two installments, and he was a buddy of William Grace, whom Kurt Reese in 1944 envisioned as one of the major touchdown points for these residual Third Reich elements that they hoped to preserve the Third Reich and German fascism intact. We're going to now jump back to 1944 And we're going to take a look at another of the organizations that Kurt Riess felt the Third Reich would have to network with. Beginning with his text again, American Vigilant Intelligence Federation, offices in the building of the Chicago Tribune. Reputedly a research organization run by Harry Jung, J-U-N-G, former labor spy, then anti-Semite, collaborator of William Dudley Pelley, active before Pearl Harbor. Quoted by the Chicago Tribune as an authority on communism, puts out numerous periodicals, leaflets, booklets, and occasionally books. Well, Harry A. Jung's American Vigilant Intelligence Federation is also an organization we took a look at as we were examining the fascist milieu which came to power on 11/22/63. George Bush, as we have seen, whether or not he was involved in Kennedy's assassination, he certainly was deeply involved with that milieu, may very well have been a CIA operative since the time of his graduation from Yale. Whether or not he was, and whether or not he was part of the Kennedy coup group, he certainly was part of the milieu, which we are looking at. And we're going to jump back now to The Dallas Conspiracy by Peter Dale Scott, a professor at the University of California at Berkeley. For my money, arguably the foremost political intellect on the American scene today. And in Peter Dale Scott's The Dallas Conspiracy, we find the following, and again, I read this last week. We're going to take a look at something called the American Security Council, which was one of the organizations linked with the WACCFL, the World Anti-Communist Congress for Freedom and Liberation, the seed group for what later became the World Anti-Communist League. And we're going to take a look at the American Security Council here, and its lobbying on behalf of the anti-Bolshevik bloc of nations, that again, an organization which was formed by Adolf Hitler in 1943. It became a key element of the World Anti-Communist League, closely linked with the Gehlen Organization, and as we looked at, an organization that helped disseminate disinformation, which in all probability necessitated a cover-up of the Kennedy assassination because people felt it might produce a Third World War if the alleged assassin was perceived to be a Soviet KGB agent, as the the anti-Bolshevik bloc of nations was helping to paint him. Returning again once to the Dallas Conspiracy, we find, and bear in mind here the American Security Council is the key element. On the first two issues, the AF, American Friends of the Anti-Bolshevik Nations position was also lobbied for vigorously by the Asian People's Anti-Communist League, and also in America by the American Security Council, a private coalition of industrialists and intelligence veterans which had been set up in 1955 by ex-agents of the FBI. The American Security Council, like Fritz Kramer's sister outfit in West Germany, the VFF, ran security checks on individuals seeking employment in private industry. Its index of over 1 million alleged, quote, subversives, unquote, was based on the anti-Semitic files of Harry A. Jung's American Vigilant Intelligence Federation, which had collaborated with the Goebbels, Taubert anti-Comintern in the 1930s. So the seed organization for the American Security Council, by the way, an organization that was deeply involved with creating the political fortunes of Ronald Reagan, the seed organization of that, as we looked at last week, was Harry A. Jung's American Vigilant Intelligence Federation, which in 1944 Kurt Riess targeted as one of the organizations that Third Reich residuo would have to network with in order to help perpetuate their political power. And again, networking is the term here. Forget conspiracy. It's a meaningless term, and in fact, at this stage of the game, it's actually a term of political reaction. Now, again, next week, what we're going to begin looking at is the Gehlen Organization itself, and in particular, what we're going to be looking at next week is how the Gehlen Organization affected American political life and American national security policy, and specifically, we're going to take a look at the Gehlen Organization as literally a Trojan horse inside the United States as a vehicle of the post-World War II Third Reich, and we're going to see how this organization basically successfully prosecuted politics as a continuation of war by other means, turning around von Clausewitz's famous principle. And the last item that we're going to look at in this installment of Radio Free America 37 is a short section from the book Blowback, subtitled America's Recruitment of Nazis and Its Effects on the Cold War. This is by Christopher Simpson, S-I-M-P-S-O-N, published in hardcover by Weidenfeld and Nicholson, copyrighted 1988. What we're looking at here, jumping back to the OSS, is the OSS's Special Intelligence Branch, its work with the Gehlen Organization, and in particular, we're going to take a look at some of the key people who have affected U.S. political and national security policy, in particular the CIA, and how they themselves go back to the operation, that they were deeply involved, I should say, with the Gehlen Organization. And it should also be borne in mind that, as I have cited in weeks past, the CIA itself is a direct outgrowth of multinational corporate policy, American-based multinational corporate policy. There's a very, very fine book out now called The Old Boys by Burton Hirsch. It's about the Wall Street elite and the CIA, and it goes back to the old OSS and how it evolved into the CIA, and shows how the principal figures in the operations and development of both organizations were basically some of the Wall Street corporate elite. Very important, very influential Wall Street attorneys. We've touched on the Dulles brothers and Sullivan and Cromwell, on Carter, Ledyard, and Milburn, and people like Frank Wisner. It should also be borne in mind that the U.S. intelligence apparatus itself is much larger than just the CIA. But by way of looking ahead to next week, and again, we're going to take a look at some networking here. We're going to take a look at a section of Blowback in which the OSS's connections with and jockeying for control of Reinhard Gehlen's Nazi Eastern Front Intelligence Organization are discussed, as we're going to see many of the people involved with the Special Intelligence Branch of OSS were people who themselves have wielded a profound effect on post-World War II political and national security and intelligence policy. Simpson writes, General William Wild Bill Donovan and Allen Dulles of America's Wartime Clandestine Operations Agency, the Office of Strategic Services, or OSS, were also tipped off about Gehlen's offer by a Dulles double agent inside the German Foreign Office. The OSS was soon jockeying with U.S. military intelligence for institutional authority over Gehlen's microfilmed records, and before long, over control of the German spy master himself. And in a footnote about this unit, the Special Intelligence Branch, Frank Wisner's Special Intelligence Branch staff, which was engaged in work with Gehlen, had more than its share of brilliant operatives who were to leave their marks on the history of U.S. espionage. They included Richard Helms, for example, later to become CIA Deputy Director for Clandestine Operations and eventually Agency Director under Presidents Johnson and Nixon; William Casey, CIA Director under President Reagan; Harry Rositsky, soon to become Chief of CIA Clandestine Operations inside the USSR and later CIA Station Chief of India; and of course Wisner himself, soon to be Chief of all American clandestine warfare operations worldwide. Of course, we took a look at Wesley Liebler, the Warren Commission counsel in charge with investigating the white Russian associates of Lee Harvey Oswald. His investigation was perhaps less than effective, I guess we could say. And, of course, he was a partner with Carter, Ledyard, and Milburn. That was the same law firm which Frank Wisner, head of the Office of Policy Coordination and CIA, worked for, an old OSS veteran. And at the same time that Wisner was Deputy Director of CIA, William Harding Jackson, another Deputy DCI, also a senior partner in Carter, Ledyard, and Milburn. It was Wisner who brought over the OUN-UPA of Stefan Bandera. And last week we took a look at how the assassination of Stefan Bandera was linked with a supposed Soviet assassination program to take place inside of the United States, of which Lee Harvey Oswald, according to some of these anti-Bolshevik bloc of nations and American Security Council people, was part. Recall Allen Dulles, of course, was made Director of Central Intelligence. He was then fired by President Kennedy for lying to him about the Bay of Pigs, and then served as a key Warren Commission member. That concludes this installment of Radio Free America number 37. We will begin looking at how some of the networks that we looked at the last 2 weeks will begin evolving in a hard way now that we've laid down some of the historical foundation. But this concludes this particular installment of Radio Free America program number 37, How the United States Lost the Second World War. December of 1941, the Nazi Party itself took a little longer. On May 16, 1943, the Nazi Party, in particular under the auspices of the SS and Gestapo, began making formal plans to not only go underground but to resurface in years to come. It should be remembered that the last 2 years or so of World War II for the Third Reich represented what is known in military terms as a rearguard action. They were basically covering their retreat, and we're going to begin taking a look at how the Nazi Party planned to go underground, and in particular, how the going underground, the eclipsing, the willful self-induced eclipse of the Nazi Party, not the demise, but the eclipse of the Nazi Party, was done under the auspices of Heinrich Himmler's SS and Gestapo. Himmler himself, as we shall see, was a student of underground political movements, and with 2 years to prepare for going underground, Himmler, with his expertise, was in a position to lay the groundwork for a resurgence of Nazism in years after the formal military defeat of the Third Reich. Following that, we're going to take a look at how, and this is a very important methodological consideration, and this particular methodological consideration is absolutely central to the long-term historical picture that we're going to be looking at, that we have been looking at in weeks past, and that we're going to be looking at for a number of weeks to come. One of the lessons that the German military, as well as the Nazi Party leadership, learned from the German defeat at the end of World War I was that they could use communism, or the threat of communism/Bolshevism, to their own political advantage. And again, it's very important to understand that neither the Third Reich nor the Reinhard Gehlen organization, that was an offshoot of it, existed in a vacuum. Far from it. In fact, if we are to properly understand these things, it is to be understood that they did not exist in a vacuum, but rather they existed in a broad political and economic milieu, which they were able to utilize to their own advantage. One of the things that I have talked about for many, many years here, and that I go into every Memorial Day, is the massive support provided by Western, in particular American, financial and industrial institutions to the fascist powers of Europe. Those industrialists who greatly feared the economic and political consequences of socialism/communism, Bolshevism, were only too happy to collaborate with fascists, and it is that political reality that is central to an understanding of how the German General Staff and the Nazi Party were able to use the threat of communism or Bolshevism in a strategic manner. One of the things that we looked at in Radio Free America program number 10 was how the German army at the end of World War I was utilized to, or the supposedly demobilized German army at the end of World War I was utilized to combat the abortive socialist or Marxist revolution in Germany that took place on November 9th, 1918. The president of the Weimar Republic, the newly created Weimar Republic, Friedrich Ebert, set up 3 military organizations: the Freikorps or Free Corps, the Einwohnerwehren, and the Zeitfreiwilligenverbände, in which the supposedly demobilized German army was reconstituted to fight communism. Germans viewed, at the end, this as World War II drew to a close, at how they viewed the coming occupation of Germany. As one might well expect, they feared most of all a partial or complete occupation of Germany by the Red Army, because that would have been inimical to the reformation not only of the industrial structure of Nazi Germany, which, recall, as we've looked at in Uncle Sam and the Swastika, was deeply involved, as well as the first 2 Radio Free America shows, was deeply involved with and cooperated with actively the multinational corporate community, American industrialists and financiers in particular. By the way, we're covering a very wide, we're covering a large piece of history this evening. There is no way, even during the course of this long archive show that I'm going to be doing in installments, that I can fill listeners, particularly new listeners, in on all of the aspects of what I'm looking at. So I strongly recommend that listeners who are new or who do not have the information, such as Uncle Sam and the Swastika, U.S. industrial cooperation with the Third Reich, the first 2 Radio Free America shows, Uncle Sam and Il Duce, please get a hold of those, because those are absolutely central to an understanding of the historical forces that we're examining during the course of Radio Free America 37. But again, the Third Reich, as its at least formal demise was approaching, understood that having the Western allies, the United States and Germany and France, occupy Germany was vital to their survival and to the perpetuation of the political realities of the Third Reich, and that the partial or complete occupation of Germany by the Soviet Union would be inimical, would be absolutely devastating to their long-term prospects for revival. Following that, we're going to take a look at a book called The Last Hero, Wild Bill Donovan by Anthony K. Brown. We're going to take a look at a very interesting, important, and enigmatic chapter in World War II history. Namely, we're going to take a look at not only the negotiations which were being undertaken by the German General Staff under Vatican auspices with the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, that was America's World War II intelligence service, the precursor of the CIA. We're going to take a look at those negotiations, those attempts by the German General Staff to open up the Western Front to Eisenhower's armies, thereby permitting the Allies, the Western Allies, I should say, to occupy most of Germany. By the way, bear in mind, too, that as any competent history of the Third Reich will demonstrate, I'm not going to go into that in any detail this evening, one of the things that Hitler sought to do during the closing months in the last year or two of the Second World War was to convince the United States and Britain to abandon their alliance with the Soviet Union and to hook up with Germany and to engage in an anti-communist crusade. Any competent history of the Third Reich, William L. Shirer's The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, any good history of Nazi Germany will discuss that, any good history of the Second World War. I'm not going to go into that at any great length, but bear in mind that that was a major strategic goal of the Third Reich during the closing years of the war. Again, we're going to be taking a look at, from The Last Hero, I should say, how the German General Staff was formally making approaches to the United States and Britain. What we're going to begin with, and for the vast bulk of the program, we're going to begin by taking a look at the historical development of the fascist milieu that we have been looking at for the past 2 weeks. We have been looking at a milieu consisting of elements of the petroleum industry, in particular the petroleum engineering industry and independent oil operators, the intelligence community, the defense industry, the political superstructure of America, and last but most assuredly not least, the Third Reich residua imported into the United States under the auspices of the intelligence organization of Reinhard Gehlen. Gehlen, whose last name once again is spelled G-E-H-L-E-N, was Hitler's chief of intelligence for the Eastern Front during World War II, and he and his entire organization, Fremde Heere Ost, or Foreign Armies East, generally abbreviated as FHO, were brought into the United States at the end of World War II. They became, in turn, the CIA's Department of Russian and Eastern European Affairs. They then became the de facto NATO intelligence organization. And finally, when the Federal Republic of Germany, the former West Germany, was incorporated in 1956, Gehlen and his organization were installed as the BND, the Bundesnachrichtendienst, the official intelligence service of first West Germany, now Germany. That organization has wielded an enormous impact on world history by virtue of its pivotal role in the Cold War, and the Gehlen organization and its effects are going to be one of the major foci of this long archive show that I'm doing. This is not to say that the Gehlen organization exists in a vacuum, far from it. On the contrary, the important thing about understanding the Gehlen organization is how it functioned, what permitted it to come into existence in the capacity that it came into existence, namely the multinational corporate milieu, which was very sympathetic to fascism, the large domestic fascist organizations in the United States, which, as we shall see, began to network with some of the elements brought in under the auspices of Gehlen and the very closely related anti-Bolshevik bloc of nations. The Gehlen organization is a vitally important organization, and we're going to be taking a look in the weeks to come at the Gehlen organization as literally a Trojan horse brought into the United States. But I don't want any listener to make the mistake of thinking that the Gehlen organization exists in a vacuum. It is pivotally important, arguably, arguably the single most important political element in the second half of the 20th century, but it most assuredly does not exist in a vacuum, and it is vital to understand the political and economic environment and also military environment that it existed in order to understand how it came to have the influence that it had. What we're going to do this evening is go back all the way to the Second World War, and we are going to begin to take a look at, we are going to take a look at the historical development of the milieu that we looked at in the last 2 weeks, namely the intersection of the American far right, as I said, the petroleum industry, the intelligence community, the Gehlen Organization, the defense industry, and some of the major American political movers and shakers over the last quarter of a century or so. The first thing that we're going to do this evening is listen to a radio show that was broadcast in America. This permitted the German General Staff to not only retain power in Germany, because not only the industrialists and former imperial government officials, but also the Social Democrats themselves. The socialists were greatly afraid of the Bolsheviks and the workers and soldiers Soviets that were set up in the course of the abortive German Revolution, so they were only too happy to enlist the support of the German General Staff and the supposedly demobilized German army. This permitted the German army to circumvent the regulations imposed, at least formally, by the Versailles Treaty. And as we have seen, the Freikorps or Free Corps, the Einwohnerwehren and the Zeitfreiwilligenverbände remained in place underground as the so-called Black Reichswehr. They not only continued to grow and to represent an underground formation and growth of the German army, but perhaps even more importantly, they systematically assassinated not only the Marxists, but the legitimate democratic leadership of Weimar Germany, thereby paving the way for Hitler's rise to power. The next thing we are going to look at is how the threat of communism was used by the German General Staff to retain the integrity of the German military and to promote its growth in spite of the Treaty of Versailles. And even more importantly, we are going to take a look at how the Allies at the end of World War I aided and abetted this situation, because they too were deeply afraid of the threat of Bolshevism. Recall that, of course, in 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution occurred, and this represented the first Marxist state in the world. Beyond that, it was an enormous empire which now had a Marxist government. This was deeply terrifying to not only American industrialists and financiers, but the General Staff, and indeed even to socialists themselves. And as a result of the fear on the part of the Western Allies that Germany, too, a major industrial power, might go, quote, communist, unquote, they aided and abetted the reinstitution not only of the former imperial government, but also of the German General Staff and the military in general. No pun intended. They saw to it that the military remained in place, and they turned a blind eye to the rearming and reformation of the German military despite the Treaty of Versailles. And this strategic consideration, the awareness on the part of the German General Staff, and later, as we will see, the Nazi Party, of how the fear of communism could be used to their own strategic and military advantage, that is central to the long-term understanding of the development of the forces that we are looking at in this massive archive show, as we are looking at the formation, the historical and political evolution of the milieu that we've been looking at the last 2 weeks, in which the American far-right, Third Reich residua, the petroleum industry, the U.S. intelligence community, the defense industry, and the mainstream American political structure are synthesized. The awareness on the part of the Germans of this tactical consideration is absolutely central to the formation and development of this milieu, and that milieu is in control not only of the United States, but the world at this time. Following that, we're going to take a look at, once again, sticking with Kurt Riess's The Nazis Go Underground, we're going to take a look at how the radio program called High Command that was broadcast during the closing year or two of the Second World War. This particular program might sound a trifle humorous to some people because it is from a stylistic or formal standpoint, somewhat dated. It might sound a trifle hammy or corny, but the information communicated is not only very important, but beyond that I will be corroborating many of the central informational points from documentary sources as we proceed through the broadcast this evening. After listening to this program, which is approximately 45 minutes in length, we are then going to begin examining some information from a very important book, a book which very tragically was eclipsed along with the work of its author during the McCarthy period. That book, from 1944, is called The Nazis Go Underground by a very important anti-fascist writer named Kurt Riess, last name R-I-E-S-S. The first thing we're going to begin looking at is how the German General Staff in World War II was looking upon their broad plans for conquering certainly Europe and possibly the world. They were not just looking at the effects of one war, but rather they were thinking in terms of a decades-long strategy. That is important to understand because we're going to be looking in weeks to come at the Gehlen Organization, which was a direct offshoot of the German General Staff and the Third Reich National Security Establishment. We're going to be taking a look at how it wielded the influence it did in the United States. But first we're going to begin taking a look at how the German General Staff planned to gain certainly European, if not world domination, and it should be understood, and this is very important, that they did not intend to do it in one war. Rather, they were looking at a long-term strategy, something to be accomplished over a long period of time, and something that I would argue that they have accomplished as we prepare to move into the 21st century. Following that, we're going to take a look at the German General Staff's realization by October and by the last quarter, I should say, of 1941, that in fact the Second World War was lost from the Axis standpoint. The German General Staff actually had a meeting on December 9th, 1941, 2 days after Pearl Harbor, at which they began to make plans for rebuilding the German army after what they saw as an inevitable defeat. Recall that, of course, on December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor was attacked by the Japanese. At that point, the United States was certain to enter the Second World War. The German General Staff understood the importance of that, as well as their inability to knock out the Soviet Union during the warm months, and the fact that the German General Staff had not planned to withstand the bitter Russian winter meant that they were going to get bogged down in a war of attrition on the Eastern Front. That is not something they had planned to do. The German General Staff, literally, on December 9th, 1941, saw the handwriting on the wall, and they began to make plans to resurface after what they understood at that point was an inevitable German defeat. They then began to make plans to rebuild the German army after the war, and that'll be the next thing that we look at. After that, we're going to take a look at the German Nazi Party, the NSDAP's plans to go underground and then resurface, although the German generals formally accepted that they were going to be defeated in